Chapter 477. Oh! Tsing Hui's gaze fell on Su Xiao. It seemed that the president of the Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce had finally understood. Very good, I will take this matter to heart. Currently, with me overseeing your Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce, before they truly understand my background, even if the people of the North Moon Peak want to take revenge for Du Longzi, they won't dare to act rashly. And during this period of time, our opportunity lies. Su Xiao responded, and then asked with a hint of probing, Lord Yuqing, I wonder if you can ask the senior master behind you to help? If that senior helps, the threat of the North Moon Peak is certainly not worth mentioning. Tsing Hui glanced at Su Xiao. Is there a need to ask such a question? If those powerful beings were really willing to help the Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce, they would have already done so. Although the Hidden Sword Continent is not far from the Heaven Wasteland domain, the forces of the Hidden Sword Continent are not comparable to that of other continents. There are dozens of experts of the Golden Core realm, and even if the North Moon Peak and Aurora Peak are added together, there are more than 10 experts of the Golden Core realm. With such a lineup, unless the powerful beings who want to send down their incarnations have a remarkable ability seed, there is no possibility of a comeback. And if they carry a remarkable ability seed, once they are targeted, they will pay the price of death. Do you think that 200 Tao rhythms is enough for a powerful being to risk his life to help the Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce solve the problem? Su Xiao was momentarily unable to answer. 200 Tao rhythms was indeed enough for a powerful being to take a risk, but this so-called risk also depended on the degree of danger. If there was only a certain level of danger, then the powerful being might not necessarily not take the risk, but if the level of danger was so high that there was a 90% chance of survival. Other than a fool, no one would gamble their life for 200 Tao rhythms. In addition to the danger, after obtaining your 200 Tao rhythms, the revenge from the Heavenly Tao is also a problem. After all, behind the Aurora Peak and North Moon Peak are the Heavenly Tao and Supreme of the 10 great organizations of chaos. Under various factors, the benefits of 200 Tao rhythms is simply not enough for any powerful being to take such a risk. I understand. Su Xiao's face revealed a hint of bitterness. Then what method does Mr. Yuqing plan to use to help the Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce get through the current crisis? Seeing that Su Xiao was depressed, Su Tong hurriedly asked. As for the method, I have already thought of one. In fact, the main reason why the Hidden Sword sect is in such a situation is because of the inaction of the Hidden Sword Peak and the rumor of the death of the Hidden Sword Venerable. If the Hidden Sword Peak is willing to stand out and maintain order, even if the North Moon Peak and the Aurora Peak have the support of the Grand Supreme in the way of heaven, they would not be so arrogant. However, if the Hidden Sword Venerable is not dead and can appear once, the arrogance of the Aurora Peak and the North Moon Peak will definitely be completely suppressed in the face of a continent with a powerful person. If the Hidden Sword Venerable is determined enough, he can completely disregard the secret influence of the Grand Supreme and the Way of Heaven and completely disintegrate the Aurora Peak and the North Moon Peak. Venerable Hidden Sword. Su Tong's eyes immediately lit up when she heard Qing Su mention the Hidden Sword Venerable. It's impossible for the Hidden Sword Venerable to die so easily. According to what I know, 1,000 years ago, when the Hidden Sword Venerable showed signs of age, he paid a great price to purchase a few heavenly resources that could extend his lifespan, including the extremely valuable Unfalling Flower and the Fruit of Eternal Life, which is even more valuable. Even if Golden Core experts only have a lifespan of 2,000 years, the effects of the Unfalling Flower and the Fruit of Eternal Life would still be sufficient for the Hidden Sword Venerable to live to 3,000 or 4,000 years old. Moreover, according to our observations, the Hidden Sword Venerable has fought against others in the past 1,000 years or so, but he hasn't suffered any heavy injuries to his foundation. His lifespan shouldn't be affected by that much either. Oh! Tsing Hui nodded slightly. This was probably the reason why the North Moon Peak and the Aurora Peak were able to restrain each other. Otherwise, the two major forces would have lost their patience long ago if there had been no movement for 100 years. Mr. Yuqing, doesn't your master have a good relationship with the Hidden Sword Venerable? If your master is able to invite the Hidden Sword Honorable out, all of the problems that our Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce is currently facing will be easily solved. Once the problems of our Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce are solved, I believe that Miss will definitely not be stingy with the 200 Taoist rhymes that she should pay you. Su Tong was full of anticipation. Su Xiao, Si Tong Zhen and the rest looked at Xing Hui, waiting for his response. Xing Hui shook his head. If I could use this method, I would have used it long ago. 200 Taoist rhymes is definitely a huge benefit for me. It's a pity. My master has contacted the Hidden Sword Venerable, but he did not reply. I came to the Hidden Sword mainland under the orders of my master. On one hand, I want to explore the Hidden Sword Venerable in the Hidden Sword mainland. On the other hand, I want to visit the Hidden Sword Venerable on behalf of my master to see if he is all right. He has already used it. Su Zhao's eyes flashed with deep disappointment. Currently, the best method that I can think of is to explore the Myriad Sword Peak. If I can attract the Myriad Sword Chime on the Myriad Sword Peak, I will be able to get the attention of the Hidden Sword Venerable. If the Hidden Sword Venerable is still fine, I will be able to get the attention of the Hidden Sword Venerable. Explore the Myriad Sword Peak? Su Xiao bitterly smiled. It's no use. We've already thought of this method. Over the past 2 years, we've secretly recruited some of the most famous sword geniuses in the continent and invited them to the Myriad Sword Peak. We've tried to use the Myriad Sword Chime to attract the attention of the Hidden Sword Venerable. Unfortunately, the Myriad Sword Peak seems to have been neglected for a long time. It's almost useless. Not to mention defeating the sword spirits and gaining their recognition, there aren't many people who can even attract the sword spirits to show themselves. In fact, in the past 100 years, the most talented person has only gained the recognition of 12 sword spirits. It's not even close to the Myriad Sword Chime. The recognition of 12 sword spirits. Xing Hui frowned. He did not expect that the difficulty of exploring the Myriad Sword Peak would be so high. Even though the Myriad Sword Chime was only an imaginary number now, and it was hard to say if there were even 100 divine weapons with sword spirits in the entire Myriad Sword Peak, even if there were only half of 100 divine weapons, there would still be 50 of them. The difference between 50 and 12 was more than 4 times. Although the hope is slim, we still have to try. Xing Hui said. Su Tong, Su Xiao, and the others saw that there was no other way and could only nod. At least now, they had Xing Hui in the Xin Hui Chamber of Commerce, whose battle strength was not inferior to that of an upper-grade golden core cultivator. Compared to the previous situation where they could not even guarantee their safety, it was much better. In a month, I will explore the Myriad Sword Peak. During this month, you will try to find a way to collect the top sword manuals of the Hidden Sword sect for me to learn and strengthen my own swordsmanship foundation. A month, isn't it a bit too rushed? Su Tong said hesitantly. It can only be a month. If it is too long, there will be changes. Xing Hui said. In fact, the changes he mentioned did not only include the North Moon Peak but also the Way of Heaven. One had to know that Broken Sword already knew about his chaos level. The reason why Broken Sword did not leak it out was because it wanted to monopolize his chaos incantation. As an almighty who had a level 11 flying sword, if Broken Sword did not care about the exhaustion and flew at full speed day and night, it would not be an extravagant hope to fly 200,000 kilometers in a day. Based on this calculation, Broken Sword Continent, which was less than 20 million kilometers away from the eastern wilderness, would only need 100 days to cross. What if Savage Sword found out about his whereabouts, and he secretly rushed over? Once they met, it would definitely be a huge problem. He could not guarantee that he could always use the backtrack skill. All right then, we will use the power of the Xin Hui Chamber of Commerce and collect all the sword manuals we can for Mr. Yu Qing in this month. Xing Hui agreed. Soon, the group set off again and returned to the Xin Hui Chamber of Commerce. When they arrived at the Xin Hui Chamber of Commerce, Su Xiao did not waste any time and used all the power of the Xin Hui Chamber of Commerce to collect sword manuals. The sword manuals that could catch the eye of the Xin Hui Chamber of Commerce were all extraordinary. The worst of them contained sword moves that could be used by true energy realm experts. In just 3 days, the number of sword manuals in Tsing Hui's cultivation room had reached 100. This was after Su Xiao, Su Tong, and the others considered that Tsing Hui's time was limited and removed the ordinary sword manuals that were not famous. Otherwise, the number of true energy realm sword manuals in front of Tsing Hui would be more than 3 times. These sword manuals, Tsing Hui spent 10 days and read through all the sword manuals. In the end, he frowned. Among the sword manuals, the sword moves in the true energy realm, spirit refining realm, spirit uniting realm, and green hell realm were better. However, at the prominent divine realm, the sword moves were obviously less effective. It was as if they existed solely to rely on the battle physique. At the true energy realm, transformative realm, and even never-ending realm, this feature was even more obvious. As for the Golden Core realm, among the 6 Golden Core realm sword manuals that he read, the strongest killing move of any sword manual was not as powerful as an attack that relied on the battle physique of the Golden Core realm. At best, it was comparable to the battle physique's talent. These sword manuals were of little value. They were tasteless but a pity to throw away. Many of the sword manuals are inferior to the Wuji sword sect's killing sword manual in terms of concept and profoundness. The only advantage they have is that the inheritance of the lifeless sword manual isn't complete, and these sword manuals can be used by Golden Core realm experts. Tsing Hui put down another Golden Core realm sword manual and sighed in his heart. All the sword moves and killing moves were accessories to the battle physique. They were created to better unleash the power of the battle physique. Rather than calling them sword manuals, they were more like supplements to the battle physique's talent techniques. After all, using innate skills consumed too much energy. It was impossible for cultivators to use their strongest innate skills to attack all the time. At this time, the sword moves derived from the sword manual could come in handy. Not only could it reduce the energy consumption, but it could also create an attack effect that was only inferior to innate skills. However, the sword manuals, they were far from the sword manuals that Tsing Hui had in mind. This is indeed a world where the battle physique is paramount. The battle physique first, then the divine abilities, and finally, the law phenomenon. Then the domain, shattering the vacuum, and turning into a real divine beast or sacred beast. That's the most powerful path. The other cultivation methods, such as alchemy, arrays, sword arts, spirit refinement, beast taming, and so on, are just supplements to the battle physique and divine abilities. Tsing Hui heaved a sigh. On Earth, he loved the sword, practiced it, learned it, and understood it. However, this was not a world for swordsmen after all. Chapter 478. Good swordsmanship, practice swordsmanship, seek swordsmanship, practice swordsmanship, comprehend swordsmanship. But in the end, this can't be the reason or excuse for me to switch to swordsmanship. A person can't give up his life for his hobbies. Just like a painter, if he can't even afford his basic living expenses, how can he devote his energy and effort to painting? No matter how fanatical his hobby is, he can only choose to face reality and solve his basic living problems first. This world is the same. The strong are respected, and danger lurks everywhere. Practicing swordsmanship can't give me powerful combat strength. It's the foundation of survival in this world, and it can't allow me to return to Earth as soon as possible to reunite with my family and friends. The only choice I have is to give up swordsmanship. Tsing Hui slowly put down the sword manual in his hand, an indescribable sense of loneliness and emptiness in his eyes. Sword Saint Tsing Hui. Perhaps I can't be called a true swordsman at all. The moment he put down the sword manual, a large chunk of his essence, energy, and spirit seemed to be stripped away from him, and the light in his eyes dimmed. He felt a sense of loss. It was as if something important had been dug out of his heart. It was completely empty, making that place feel incomparably cold and empty. But, so what if his willpower was low? He still had to continue walking down the path. Low willpower couldn't be the reason or excuse for him to exile himself and abandon himself to depravity. Humans had to face reality in the end. Enduring the emptiness and loneliness, Tsing Hui focused his attention on the Son of Chaos interface in the Chaos Temple. Battle physique, divine abilities, domains, divinity, and even a world with a thought were the strongest cultivation paths in this world. Naturally, he needed to devote more energy to this cultivation system. But before that, preserving his life was the most important thing. Tsing Hui glanced at the newly acquired 100-year-old Dao item, then at the accumulated Dao aura in the Fortune Jade. It was time to cultivate the supreme immortal technique, Yin-Yang reversal, to great success and completely resolve the crisis brought about by the sword wielder. A month passed quickly. When the appointed time arrived, Su Tong, Su Xiao, and the others waited outside Tsing Hui's courtyard early in the morning. Whether or not the Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce could be resolved once and for all depended on this moment. Although Su Tong, Su Xiao, Xing Lian, Si Tongjin, and the healed Elder Jin Yin didn't have high hopes for Tsing Hui's trip to the Myriad Sword Peak this time, to the Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce in crisis, any hope, no matter how small it was, had to be firmly grasped with all their might. The Myriad Swords Peak was located in the southeast corner of the Hidden Sword Sect. It was about 300 kilometers away from the Hidden Sword Peak, which was the core area of the Hidden Sword Sect. It was neither the core area of the Hidden Sword Sect nor the border area of the Hidden Sword Sect. The sect had always had a rule that any cultivator could become a disciple of the sect as long as they could enter the Myriad Sword Peak and obtain the recognition of one sword spirit. If they could obtain the recognition of more than 10 sword spirits, they could directly become a true disciple of the sect. If they could obtain the recognition of 100 sword spirits, they could become the sect leader's personal disciple. If they could cause the 10,000 sword chime, the sword Venerable Hidden Sword would personally take them in and make them the next sect leader. As the number of sword spirits in the Myriad Sword Peak dwindled, the sword spirits that could not lose their spirituality after such a long time were all outstanding sword spirits. Although they did not have the supreme divine power they had in their heyday, it was getting more and more difficult to obtain the recognition of these arrogant sword spirits. The 10,000 sword chime had also become a saying. Currently, the so-called 10,000 sword chime had been compressed time and time again. It was now to the point where the sword Venerable Hidden Sword would personally take them in as a disciple and make them the next sect leader of the Hidden Sword sect. Even so, in recent years, the person with the best results had only obtained the recognition of 12 sword spirits at the same time. It was almost 10 times worse than 100 sword chime. They're here. The people from the Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce are here. As soon as the group of people from Qing Su set foot in the vicinity of the Myriad Swords Peak, countless figures immediately appeared around the peak. They pointed at Qing Su and the group of people from the Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce. That's the expert who killed Du Longzi of the North Moon Peak? His bearing is indeed extraordinary. I heard that the great elder of the North Moon Peak wanted to kill him personally. However, considering that he was about to break into the Myriad Sword Peak, he wanted to see if he was a real talent before making a decision. If he was a top talent, for the future development of the Hidden Sword sect, the great elder of the North Moon Peak could choose to turn hostility into friendship. However, if he was just a facade, what awaited him would be a thunderous strike. The sword spirits in the Myriad Sword Peak don't have much ability, but they all talk big. It's difficult to obtain the recognition of these sword spirits. It's even harder to obtain the recognition of all the sword spirits at the same time. It seems that even the ancestor of our Hidden Sword sect, the Hidden Sword Venerable, could only cause the 36 spiritual swords to vibrate at the same time. All kinds of discussions could be heard from the crowd. As Tsing Hui and the others stepped onto the Myriad Sword Peak, more and more cultivators from the Hidden Sword sect heard the commotion and rushed over, looking like they wanted to join in the fun. Mr. Yu Qing, the Myriad Sword Peak is right in front of us. Su Xiao led the way in front and at the same time, looked at a mountain peak that was not very tall. Although this mountain peak did not look very tall, the entire mountain peak was mainly brown, like a piece of black iron ore. On top of it, there were many divine swords of different shapes and sizes. The number of swords was densely packed, and at a glance, there were no less than a few million swords. In the ancient books of the Hidden Sword sect, there seems to be a record that the cornerstone of the Myriad Sword Peak has a mysterious power. If a divine sword is inserted into the peak, over time, the divine sword will breed a sword spirit. Therefore, all the swords that were no longer used or were unnecessary in the hidden sword sect were all moved to the myriad sword peak and inserted into it. Over time, over 1,000 years, the myriad sword peak has accumulated more than 300 swords. Su Xiao noticed that Tsing Hui was sizing up the many swords on the myriad sword peak and hurriedly explained. At the end, he added, "But it turns out that this is obviously just a rumor. If the myriad sword peak really has the characteristic of breeding divine swords and giving birth to a sword spirit, the spiritual swords on the myriad sword peak would not have become ordinary swords with the passage of time." Tsing Hui looked at the myriad sword peak in front of him and could not help but think of the myriad sword peak in the Lorraine kingdom of the eastern wilderness. There was also a peerless divine sword in the myriad sword peak, and that divine sword was heavily sealed and trapped in a rock. No one knew how many years had passed and no one had discovered it. The myriad sword peak in front of him was many times larger than the stone pillar that the broken sword in the ancestral land of the myriad sword peak had originally been. In addition, there was a rumor that it seemed to breed a sword spirit. Inside, could it be a peerless divine sword? Could it be the legendary imperial demon refining sword? Just as Tsing Hui was pondering, a sharp gaze swept towards Tsing Hui. Just by looking at it, Tsing Hui could faintly feel an oppressive aura. As Ching Su followed the light, his gaze landed on an old man very soon. Hidden Swordmaster only accepted him as a disciple after he became a powerful figure. Due to his overflowing talent, Hidden Swordmaster named him North Divine Powers, which means that he has the potential to reach the Divine Powers realm. In fact, the talent that he has shown is worthy of the title of Divine Powers. He is not even 1,000 years old, but he has already condensed a superior-grade gold core. It is said that after receiving many benefits from the way of heaven, his superior-grade gold core has been perfected. Next, he can choose to continue cultivating and condense a peerless gold core, or give it a shot and try to breed a divine powers. Su Xiao noticed Tsing Hui's gaze and immediately introduced him in a low voice with a hint of reverence in his tone. At present, he is the most powerful figure in Hidden Sword Sect. Even the Grand Elder of Hidden Sword Peak, who has the 12th level divine weapon, 8 Desolation Demon Vanquishing Sword, may not be able to beat him. More than half of the reason why North Moon Peak can develop to such a scale is because of Grand Elder North Divine Powers. Perfected superior grade gold core. Tsing Hui looked at North Divine Powers. No wonder he could give him such a strong sense of oppression. If Tsing Hui did not use the 10 Burning Heavens immortal technique, he may not be able to fight against such a powerful figure. If the other party's chaotic level was high enough and had recovery characteristics above the 10th level, Tsing Hui might even be at a disadvantage. The people from Aurora Peak and Hidden Sword Peak are also here. When Su Xiao introduced North Divine Powers to Tsing Hui, Su Tong reminded him in a low voice. Tsing Hui glanced around and saw that there were more than 10 Gold Core Realm experts at the foot of Myriad Swords Peak. Although they represented different forces, it also proved the strength of the Hidden Sword Sect, the supreme ruler of the Hidden Sword Continent. Anyone can enter Myriad Swords Peak as long as they abide by the rules. Even the sect leader is not qualified to stop them. However, before entering Myriad Swords Peak, you have to register with the 2 peak guarding elders. Su Xiao said with a smile. Okay. Tsing Hui said and came to the foot of Myriad Swords Peak. The 10,000 Swords Peak was no more than 1,000 meters tall. It was mainly brown and black, like a giant meteorite that fell from the sky. There was not a single blade of grass growing on the peak, and there was no living creature. It was full of loneliness and desolation. Apart from the countless sharp swords, there was nothing else. Fortunately, because the Hidden Sword Sect had people who entered Myriad Swords Peak all year round, there was still a path on the peak. One of the 2 peak guarding elders lived in a thatched cottage in front of the path. At this moment, the peak guarding elder obviously knew that Tsing Hui was going to enter the mountain. He walked out of the thatched cottage and saw Tsing Hui. He said in a deep voice, "When you enter the mountain, you must remember that your cultivation cannot exceed the true Qi realm. Once you exceed the true Qi realm, although you can defeat the sword spirit, You will not be able to gain the sword spirit's recognition. Even if you reach the peak, it will be meaningless. Furthermore, when we find that you have used your true Qi realm cultivation, we will invite you down the mountain. I can't use my true Qi realm cultivation? Xing Hui listened and nodded. There are many treasured swords on the mountain, but you still have to sense which one is a spiritual sword and which one is an ordinary sword. If you can't even find a spiritual sword, you are not qualified to enter the mountain. Furthermore, after you find a spiritual sword and awaken the sword spirit in it, it is best to maintain your awakening realm cultivation and fight with the sword spirit. Otherwise, even if you defeat the sword spirits with your true Qi, the chances of gaining their recognition will not be more than 30%. However, the specifics will still depend on your own swordsmanship. I understand. Please. The peak guarding elder gestured to Xing Hui with his hand. Immediately, Xing Hui stepped forward and directly stepped onto Myriad Sword's peak. Chapter 479. Aunt Tong, Mr. Yuqing? Can he do it? At the foot of the mountain, Su Xiao looked at Qing Su, who had set foot on the mountain, with a sliver of worry. Su Tong hesitated for a moment and said, Mr. Yuqing's teacher is acquainted with the hidden sword venerable. He even went to the Wanjian Peak in the past. Since he sent his disciple here, he must have some confidence. Otherwise, why would he send Mr. Yuqing across the sea to come here? Let's have some confidence in Mr. Yuqing. Is that so? That's great. If Mr. Yuqing can really trigger the resonance of 10,000 swords. No, he doesn't need to trigger the resonance of 10,000 swords. This rule was changed more than 200 years ago. As long as Mr. Yuqing can trigger the resonance of 100 swords, he will definitely be able to alert the hidden sword honorable. At that time, he will tell the hidden sword honorable about the current situation that our Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce is in. The hidden sword honorable will definitely not turn a blind eye. Su Xiao said happily. Su Tong nodded as well. However, she was not very optimistic. Resonance of 100 swords? Over the years, how many experts who claimed to be sword geniuses had come to the Wanjian Peak? But in the end, even the best one was only recognized by 12 sword spirits, which was 10 times worse than the resonance of 100 swords. Mr. Yuqing might be overflowing with talent, but judging from his attacking methods, he was obviously not a sword cultivator. Even in the hidden sword continent, where the sword was always respected, there was no one who could cause 100 swords to chant at the same time. Then, how could a person who came from outside the hidden sword continent and majored in the battle physique get the recognition of 100 sword spirits at the same time, which was also the recognition of all the spirit swords on the Myriad Sword Peak? Moreover, once Xing Hui showed that he could trigger the resonance of 100 swords, the Golden Elixir Realm experts on the Aurora Peak and North Moon Peak would definitely interfere. After all, they were the ones who were most afraid of Hidden Sword Supreme. Xing Hui did not know that his arrival on the Wanjian Peak had stirred up everyone's thoughts. The moment he stepped on the Wanjian Peak, he immediately felt that the peak was unusual. Sword essence. In this mountain, his sword intent seemed to have been magnified by a magnifying glass. His original 10% sword intent could almost display 30% of its power. It allows a cultivator's sword intent power to increase by almost 3 times compared to before. Mental strength is different from other attributes. Increasing one's attack level by 10 might bring about a difference of several times, but increasing one's mental strength by 10 levels is the limit. This is also the reason why, even without the help of secret techniques, a cultivator with a mental strength level of 60 or even a cultivator with a mental strength level of 90 can withstand the mental attacks of a cultivator with a mental strength level of 90. This 3 times increase is almost equivalent to raising my mental strength level from less than 100 to 120, or even 130. Xing Hui was secretly surprised. This Myriad Swords Peak really did have some tricks up its sleeves. No wonder there was a rumor that this peak could give birth to a sword spirit. There was no smoke without fire. Xing Hui slowly walked on the mountain path of Myriad Swords Peak with the help of his sword intent that had been stimulated several times. He carefully sensed the sword intents emitted by the many divine weapons on both sides of the mountain path. Compared to cultivators who were in the dark, he, whose sword intent was close to perfection, had a unique advantage in sensing spiritual swords. Even if he had converged the vast and majestic vital essence in his body when he set foot on the 10,000 Swords Peak, and even condensed the Golden Crow's divine soul and the Torch Dragon's divine soul in his spiritual world into a single point, forcefully compressing his cultivation base to below the awakening realm, he could still clearly determine which divine weapon contained a strong sword intent and which one contained a weak sword intent. Relying on this feeling, Xing Hui searched for a moment on the mountain path and quickly sensed the location of a spirit sword. Buzz buzz. Standing in front of the spirit sword, Xing Hui's sword intent burst out from his spiritual world, as if it had turned into an invisible sword and slashed into the spirit sword. As the spirit sword shook slightly, a stream of light burst out from the spirit sword, and soon, an elegant and otherworldly man appeared. The man's figure looked a little weak, but his aura was still fluctuating. He was not weaker than an expert in the awakening realm, and there was even a faint trend of him approaching the true energy realm. Moreover, as his figure appeared, he waved his hand, and the spirit sword immediately fell into his hand. With the sword in hand, the elegant and otherworldly aura on his body suddenly changed, becoming cold and sharp. Xing Hui, who had compressed his vital essence and soul, felt a faint pain on his face when the sword was pointed at him. The strength of this deterrence had already exceeded that of an ordinary true energy realm cultivator. "So you're the one who awakened my spirituality." The sword spirit held the spirit sword and muttered. Then he seemed to look at his body again, and a trace of vicissitude and loneliness flashed in his eyes. "I thought I would never wake up again. So, I still exist." Xing Hui stared at the sword spirit in front of him, his expression grave. The mountain guarding elder's words were still in his ears. When dealing with sword spirits, one could not use cultivation beyond the true energy realm. Violators would be personally asked to leave the mountain by the mountain guarding elder. However, the piercingly cold and sharp aura emitted from the sword spirit in front of him, how could he win without using cultivation above the true energy realm? "My name is Tingshua." The man slowly came back to his senses and held the spirit sword in his hand horizontally. "Experiencer, use your way of the sword to defeat me. Let me know that a true swordsman still exists in this world." Way of the sword. Hearing the man's words, Xing Hui's heart skipped a beat, as if he had vaguely thought of something. However, at this time, the man named Tingshua in front of him did not give him any more time. He brazenly attacked and stabbed out with his sword. This sword was only equivalent to the strength of an awakening realm cultivator. However, the moment this sword was stabbed out, Xing Hui felt that his vision was completely filled with the sword light of this sword. It was a kind of indescribable brilliance. It was also a kind of brilliance that could not be described with words. Qing Su saw a charm in the strike, a charm that made his mind sink into it. It was just like how if a person was painting quietly in a garden and the autumn wind rustled in, when outsiders stepped into the garden, they would be attracted by the concept in the painting. They would also slow down unknowingly, afraid that their footsteps would disturb the tranquility and beauty. The sword that Tingshua had stabbed out was the same. That kind of concentration, that kind of naturalness, made him feel as if his mind was seized by the sword light of this sword, and he was immersed in the sword's elegance. After a while, the sword intent roared. The shock formed by the collision of the two sword intents caused Xing Hui to quickly wake up. At this time, he seemed to have thought that he was fighting with this sword spirit in swordsmanship, not admiring the mystery of the other party's swordsmanship and immersing himself in the mystery of the other party's swordsmanship. Without any hesitation, Xing Hui's body, which had been liberated multiple times and constantly tempered, erupted with a powerful force. The sword light flashed, sweeping out bursts of thunder under the extreme speed, fiercely colliding with Tingshua's sword shadow that was stabbing down. Although he deliberately suppressed the inner qi in his body and even condensed the divine souls of the Golden Crow and the Torch Dragon into a single point, the pure power brought by his strong physique still shook the spirit sword in Tingshua's hand and sent it flying backward. The tranquil and intoxicating sword intent was completely shattered by this overbearing and violent power. breaking all techniques with one force. Bang! The spirituality collapsed. A part of Ting Shua's body suddenly disappeared, flying more than 10 meters away before falling to the ground. His face was even more gloomy than before. He glanced at Xing Hui and did not launch another attack. Instead, he shook his head regretfully, and then, the spirituality converged and re-injected into the spirit sword. At this time, Xing Hui seemed to see clearly that the spirit sword's name was Ting Shua. What is this? Xing Hui walked a few steps to Ting Shua's sword, his mind not only recalling the tranquil sword intent that he had suddenly immersed himself in, but at the same time, the image of Ting Shua's spirit body converging flashed across his mind. I defeated the sword spirit, but didn't get the sword spirit's recognition? Xing Hui figured out what had happened to him. Although he had suppressed the power of his true essence and divine soul, his body, which had been constantly tempered by true essence over the years, still had a crushing advantage over the sword spirit, who was merely at the awakening realm. Just now, when he suddenly woke up from the shock of Ting Shua's sword intent, he did not control his strength well and severely injured the sword spirit, so, failed? Frowning, Xing Hui stepped forward again and used his sword intent to shake Ting Shua's sword spirit, trying to awaken the sword spirit of Ting Shua. Unfortunately, there was no movement. Ting Shua's sword seemed to have turned into an ordinary iron sword. It did not respond to Xing Hui's sword intent at all. Helpless, Xing Hui could only change his direction. He slightly sensed the area where the sword intent was stronger and walked toward the next spirit sword. As Xing Hui had just set foot on Wanjian Peak, he was not far from the foot of the mountain. Everyone at the foot of the mountain clearly saw the process of him fighting with the sword spirit. Although he defeated the sword spirit, he did not get the sword spirit's recognition. The cultivators on North Moon Peak, Aurora Peak, and other peaks all breathed a sigh of relief. It really didn't work. It seems that we worried too much. Like I said, the top sword masters of the hidden sword continent who have dedicated their lives to the sword can only get the recognition of a few sword spirits. Yu Qing, even if he has amazing means, it is still wishful thinking for him to get the recognition of the sword spirit. He can find a spirit sword in the first place and awaken the sword spirit in the spirit sword. It can be seen that he has some ability, but this ability is not worth mentioning for many cultivators of the hidden sword continent. If we talk about the study and understanding of sword manuals, swordsmanship, and swordsmanship, the hidden sword continent can definitely be ranked in the top 10 even in Heaven Wasteland. All kinds of voices came from the mouths of the people of the hidden sword sect. They all had expected this. Su Xiao and the others of the Xinhui Chamber of Commerce also looked lonely. Mr. Yu Qing. Sigh. Perhaps Mr. Yu Qing is an expert in the way of the sword in his master's eyes, but to our hidden sword continent, he's nothing. You have to know that the great hidden sword venerable had once discussed the way of the sword with the White Rainbow Sword Sect's Supreme Sword Master. And in the end, the Supreme Sword Master was impressed by his understanding of the way of the sword. From this, it can be seen that the hidden sword venerable's understanding of the way of the sword and our hidden sword sect's deep foundation in the way of the sword. Even the disciples of our hidden sword sect can't cause 100 swords to chant at the same time, let alone Mr. Yu Qing, who's just a cultivator of the sword, Xing Lian sighed. Although they had already guessed that this might be the result when Xing Hui went to Wanjian Peak, when this scene really happened in front of them, they still could not suppress the disappointment in their hearts. The idea of awakening the hidden sword venerable by going to Wanjian Peak was obviously not going to work. Chapter 480. Bang! Another sword spirit was defeated by Xing Hui. It turned into a beam of light and returned to the spiritual sword without a sound. This was the third sword spirit that Xing Hui had defeated. He defeated the sword spirits again and again, but failed to gain their recognition. He was just like those cultivators who had come to the Myriad Swords Peak. When the people at the foot of the mountain saw this, their interest was greatly reduced. Almost half of the cultivators who had gathered at the foot of the mountain to watch the show had left. Even the people from the Aurora Peak, the North Moon Peak, and the Hidden Sword Peak who had heard the news had left. Only the people from the Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce stayed. They looked at Xing Hui, who was gradually becoming indistinct. There was an indescribable sadness in their eyes. It shouldn't have anything to do with cultivation. Xing Hui recalled the sword spirit that he had just defeated. He had been fighting with the sword spirit for 6 whole hours. During those 6 hours, he had been controlling his own strength, keeping it at the level of the awakening realm. Even if it was only the strength of his body, he had not used any attacks above the true energy realm. But even so, in the end, he still did not gain the recognition of that sword spirit. If it's not related to my own strength, then what method should I use to defeat them to gain their recognition? Xing Hui was silent for a moment. He stepped forward again and came in front of a new spiritual sword. Buzz buzz. The sword essence vibrated. The spiritual sword in front of him was stimulated by Xing Hui's sword essence and immediately manifested. This was a sword spirit with a sharp aura that gave people a feeling of coldness. My name is Tian Quebec. I'm a cultivator. Let me see your sword principle. Wait. Xing Hui looked at the sword spirit, Tian K, who was about to summon his spiritual sword and attack. He said in a low voice, "What exactly is the sword principle that you keep talking about?" When I fought with the previous sword spirits, I used my own comprehension of sword intent and used it as a foundation to activate the sword arts derived from sword intent. However, I was unable to gain your recognition time and time again. Then, tell me, what is the way of the sword that you speak of? Sword Dao, what exactly is it? Xing Hui's question made Tian K a little confused. It looked at Xing Hui as if it was thinking of something. However, after a long while, it still frowned and could not think of anything. I don't know. It's been too long. Perhaps it's because my memories are missing, or perhaps it's because of some other reason. In short, I can't answer you, but there's a voice in my heart telling me that the brand of my sword Dao still remains in my body. When I see a sword Dao that can truly resonate with me, I'll naturally acknowledge its existence. Tian K said in a low voice. His tone seemed to contain an indescribable pain. It was a pain that even it did not understand. It was as if it clearly knew that it had something incomparably important to it, something so important that it had given up its entire life. However, it was unaware of it and still stubbornly clung to that belief, waiting for the day when it would awaken and regain its glory. Let's begin. Tian K said with a hollow tone, as though he was an artificial intelligence mechanically carrying out his duties. That was all. Bang! The swords clashed and sparks burst forth. An hour later, Tian K's spirituality dimmed. He looked at Xing Hui, who had been suppressing his strength and had been stabbed 12 times. There was still no light in his eyes, as though he was an old man with one foot in the grave. You worked very hard. This is not the sword principle that I want. Whoosh! As Tian K finished speaking, his figure returned to the spiritual sword, but it had lost its color. Phew! Xing Hui panted slightly. Even though he had been stabbed 12 times, the recovery effect was too strong. In the time it took for him to catch his breath, the sword wounds had already begun to heal. In less than 10 breaths, only a red mark was left on the sword wounds. It's still not the sword principle. Could it be that I have to suppress my strength to the blood-changing realm? But the strength of a sword spirit surpasses that of an ordinary true chi realm cultivator. Compared to a spirit refining realm cultivator, they are not inferior. In addition, they are equivalent to the combination of sword intents. Even if their spirituality has been worn down over the years, they still have a strong resistance against sword intents. My sword intents are only able to display less than 10% of its power. If I were to suppress my strength to the blood-changing realm, even with the recovery effect of a rank 10 True Chi realm cultivator, I would not be their opponent. Xing Hui was filled with heaviness. The difference in strength was too big. It was not something that he could win by risking his life. Sword principle. Xing Hui carefully recalled the words of the sword spirits. Almost every sword spirit would mention the 2 words sword principle. It could be seen that the core of the problem was the sword principle. As for the sword principle, is the killing sword principle of the ancient sword principle considered a sword principle that could gain their recognition? Xing Hui's mind flashed with various changes regarding the killing sword principle. However, the ancient killing sword principle corresponded to the white tiger, one of the 6 saints. In the cultivation world, the upper limit of a ferocious beast's growth was the immortal level. Even the top ferocious beasts would reach the peak of immortal level rank 6 if they did not encounter a great opportunity. Spiritual beasts' growth was rank 12, while holy beasts' growth was rank 18. The 6 saints' growth was between mythical beasts and holy beasts. Their growth could reach rank 19, and some of them could even reach rank 20 if they were lucky enough. However, compared to the many sword principles that Xing Hui was using, they were still lacking. One had to know that although most of the sword manuals that he had obtained were only at the endless and golden core levels, the principles of these sword manuals were basically aimed at mythical beasts. The strength of the sword principle was directly related to the principles of the sword. After all, the sword principle was the cultivator's own will. After a moment of silence, Xing Hui went forward again. Not long after, he found another sword spirit. While he was deep in thought and searching for the sword spirit, his injuries had all recovered. Although his clothes were tattered and he looked a little pathetic, it did not affect his combat strength at all. Buzz buzz. The sword principle was activated. Soon, the sword spirit in the spiritual sword was awakened. A middle-aged man who looked gentle and elegant like a spring breeze appeared in front of Xing Hui. When the man appeared, his eyes were also filled with confusion. However, after a while, he recovered and nodded slightly at Xing Hui. It's been a long time since I've seen a satisfactory experiencer. I hope your sword principle can inspire me. I'm Qing Yi, please enlighten me. Sword principle. Xing Hui looked at the man in front of him. Although he did not have much hope, he still said, I want to know, what exactly is the sword principle that you speak of? What is your sword principle? What exactly is the sword principle that we speak of? Qing Yi was slightly stunned while a trace of bewilderment appeared on his face. After that, he seemed to have fallen into deep thought, and this sort of deep thought only lasted for a few breaths of time before it was gradually replaced by a trace of pain and helplessness. My sword Dao. I'm sorry. Perhaps it has been too long, and I've already forgotten exactly what my sword Dao is. You've forgotten? Xing Hui looked at Qing Yi in disbelief. As a sword spirit, you can actually forget your sword principle? I can't understand it either. But it's been too long. Too much time has passed. Anything can happen in such a long period of time. Maybe I suffered some serious injury and lost my memories, or maybe my way of the sword was defeated by someone and disappeared, leaving only the instincts of the way of the sword in me, or maybe some other reason. But experiencer, this is not something you need to ask. Let me see your way of the sword. Wait, I have another question. Why do you call me experiencer? Why? A trace of confusion flashed in Qing Ye's eyes. I can't answer you. It's been too long and I can't remember clearly. Perhaps this is my mission here. The too long you speak of, just how long is it? Qing Yi shook his head. I've already forgotten the concept of time from repeated extremely long slumbers. I only know that countless lifetimes might have passed. I don't remember much anymore. Since you've woken me up, then I hope your sword Dao can be refreshing and inject a trace of a ripple into my life that's like a pool of stagnant water. In the next moment, Qing Yi no longer spoke to him and attacked with his sword. His sword principle was like a cool breeze. It was like a leisurely early summer, facing the gentle sunlight, looking for a willow tree by a clear stream, lying down on the green grass under the willow tree, with a blade of grass in his mouth, feeling the cool breeze, looking up at the clear blue sky and white clouds. Enough! A voice suddenly interrupted this indescribable feeling of relaxation. In the next moment, the scorching sun shone brightly. The sun above his head that was emitting gentle sunlight became incomparably tyrannical. Endless radiance mixed with rolling heat waves, burning this picturesque scenery of the mountains into ashes. This was the counterattack of Xing Hui's sword principle. He had had enough of defeating the sword spirits time and time again, and seeing their regretful and dejected expressions time and time again. He had already lost patience with his adventures in the myriad swords peak. Next, he was not willing to forcefully suppress his own cultivation. At least, he would not suppress his cultivation to the level of a mortal, causing himself to be injured every time he fought with the sword spirits. Even if these injuries were nothing to his 10th level recovery ability, and he would completely recover in a short time, but he had had enough. He wanted to use the dominance of his sword principle to crush them fair and square. There were so many sword spirits on the mountain. After crushing all of them, he did not believe that he would not be able to obtain the recognition of 100 sword spirits and trigger 100 sword hymns. Bang! Qin Ye's figure abruptly appeared from the scroll-like illusion. However, unlike the other sword spirits, after being forcibly defeated by Tsing Hui's sword principle, its face did not have its usual dejected expression. Instead, it had a trace of surprise. What a tyrannical sword principle! What a violent sword principle! This sword principle is like a huge sun with boundless power, burning the sky and boiling the sea. As expected, the sword principle that I have comprehended is not suitable for killing at all. It is only suitable for the mountains and rivers. Your sword principle is the true sword principle of killing. Looking at Qin Yi, who had a strange expression, Tsing Hui paused slightly. My sword principle? Although your mastery of the sword Dao is still shallow, you've already laid down a foundation. My sword Dao is not focused on killing, so it's impossible for me to be a match for your sword Dao. Therefore, you've obtained my approval. Cultivator, please tell me your name. Tsing Hui looked at Qin Yi, somewhat stunned. He succeeded just like that? So simple? Could it be that these sword spirits all bullied the weak and feared the strong? He used all his strength and immediately obtained the recognition of a sword spirit. Chapter 481. Wait! Tsing Hui, who was stunned by the scene in front of him, suddenly had a flash of inspiration. Sword principle? Why had his sword principle failed to gain the recognition of the previous sword spirits? But now, when he used the sword intent and mobilized the brilliant and domineering power of the sword intent, it burned the sword intent scene created by green leaf sword intent to ashes? The main reason was the essence of the sword principle. The sword principle that the sword spirits in front of him needed was not the many sword techniques that he had mastered, nor was it the conventional sword intent that the cultivators of this world referred to, the sword principle that they needed. It was an extremely pure will, an extremely pure belief. Just like green leaf in front of him. His belief seemed to have nothing to do with the sword principle, but in the end, he was able to use this sword principle as a foundation to become a sword spirit. Previously, he had also used the torch dragon sword intent to fight against those sword spirits. Although he had defeated these sword spirits by relying on the strength of his sword intent, he could not obtain their recognition because the sword intent that had fused with the torch dragon divine soul was no longer pure in essence. It was just like how Tsing Hui had witnessed Sword Master Bai Heng's sword intent in the past, which had led to intense conflict and doubt about his own sword intent. Whether it was Sword Master Bai Heng or all the cultivators of the sword principle in this world, their sword intent all originated from the bloodlines of the divine beasts and sacred beasts that they had cultivated. Rather than saying that they had condensed their own will, it was more accurate to say that their thought process and mental state were more in line with the divine beasts that they had cultivated. Every time their sword intent broke through, they would become closer to the original form of the divine beasts. When they reached the 4th level of the Saint Realm, they would transform into divine beasts and sacred beasts. How could such a sword intent be called a true sword intent? How could such a sword principle be called a true sword principle? Although he did not have a true definition of the sword principle in his mind, after cultivating the sword for so many years, he was certain that this world's definition of the sword principle was wrong. Whether it was the many sword manuals that he had read during this period of time or the killing sword principle that had been passed down from ancient times, they were all just accessories of the bloodline cultivation system of the divine beasts and sacred beasts. Their true foundation was not the sword principle, but the divine beasts and sacred beasts. Just like Sword Master Bai Heng, if he asked her to give up her sword intent, it might affect her cultivation, but the effect was not great. However, if he asked her to give up the torch dragon bloodline that she had cultivated, she might even die on the spot. They didn't offer themselves to the sword Tao that they cultivated. Instead, they offered themselves to the bloodlines of divine beasts and saint beasts, which originated from the supreme Tao of this world. How could such a Tao of sword, such a Tao of sword, such a Tao of sword, such a Tao of sword that was born for the bloodline of godly beasts and holy beasts, be recognized by these sword spirits? How could it make 100 swords sing and 10,000 swords fly together? Is this the sword Tao that you really need, the one that you truly acknowledge? Is this the sword Tao that you've completely condensed and manifested by your own essence, qi, and spirit? Is this the sword Tao that you really need? Xing Hui suddenly had an idea. At this moment, the torch dragon sword intent in his spiritual world suffered a serious impact. Since when had his sword intent changed from the sword intent of the Eastern Sun sword mantra to the sword intent that was born from comprehending the torch dragon spirit? Refining God Pavilion. In the refining God Pavilion in the sky. From the divine refining pavilion in the sky, he began to comprehend the torch dragon sword intent that belonged to Master Zhu Zhao in the condensing light sword. Since then, his sword intent had taken a detour and was getting further and further away from the true sword Tao. Moreover, from then on, all his energy, essence, and spirit no longer focused on the Eastern Sun sword mantra, nor did he try to break the limits of his essence, and spirit to condense a stronger sword intent. Instead, he put all his attention on the cultivation of his bloodlines. The Golden Crow bloodline and the Torch Dragon bloodline. Moreover, as he delved deeper into these two bloodlines, his comprehension of the Eastern Sun sword mantra also decreased. In the end, he completely abandoned this technique. Now that he thought about it, how long had it been since he recalled the Eastern Sun sword mantra, the sword mantra of the Eastern Sun sword sect, in his mind? So, this is the sword intent that you want, Xing Hui muttered to himself. Immediately his gaze fell on the Torch Dragon sword intent. Judging from Qing Ye's attitude just now, he was barely acknowledging his sword Tao. After all, the sword intent condensed from the Eastern Sun sword mantra was only at the beginner level and was far from the initial level. He estimated that if he really wanted to make 100 swords sing at the same time, his sword intent would have to be at the initial level or even the phenomenal level. Moreover, it was even at the phenomenal level with the Eastern Sun sword mantra as the foundation. However, if he really switched to cultivating sword intent, the Torch Dragon sword intent would definitely collapse, and by then, it would have a great impact on his cultivation. For a moment, Xing Hui couldn't help but fall silent. At this time, he had to make a choice. If he couldn't give up the Torch Dragon sword intent, he could forget about breaking through the myriad swords peak and making 100 swords sing at the same time. If he gave up the Torch Dragon sword intent, he was confident that he could cultivate the sword intent derived from the Eastern Sun sword mantra to the initial level in half a month with his foundation and comprehension over the years. As for the phenomenal level, God knew how much time it would take. If he couldn't cultivate the sword intent to the phenomenal level, he would probably only have a 30% chance of making 100 swords sing at the same time. The price he had to pay was that the Torch Dragon sword intent would collapse, and even his Torch Dragon Divine Soul would be affected. The collapse of the Torch Dragon Divine Soul would definitely have an impact on his cultivation. Not to mention much, his combat strength would be reduced by at least a third. What he needed the most now was strength. Only with strength could he protect himself and obtain more Taoist rhymes. Was it worth it to kill the goose that laid the golden eggs if he lost a third of his combat strength for a mere 200 Tao runes? Let's see how far I can go first. Xing Hui muttered to himself. At the next moment he had already walked up the mountain peak again. Not long after, he appeared in front of a spiritual sword. The sword intent emitted from this spiritual sword was stronger than the previous ones. Moreover, before activating the spirituality in this spiritual sword, Xing Hui already felt a biting cold aura, which was completely different from the refreshing aura of the green leaf. This sword spirit. Xing Hui stepped forward and his sword intent vibrated, quickly awakening the sword spirit. In reality, his senses were not wrong. The pressure that the sword spirit gave off when it manifested was much more powerful than the sword spirits from before. Just the pulses of sword intent it gave off had already caused the sword intent of the green ruins to repel him. If he did not use the torch dragon sword intent and just relied on the basic sword intent he had derived from the Eastern Yang sword scripture, he probably would have been defeated by the sword spirit before long. My name is Zhui Feng. Experiencer, wake me up from my slumber. Let me see what kind of sword principle you have comprehended. The sword spirit, Zhui Feng, appeared and didn't waste time talking nonsense with Xinghui. With a low growl, the sword in his hand suddenly stabbed out like a stream of light. Compared to the green leaf sword, the heavenly fault sword, and the Tingshua sword, Zhui Feng's sword was filled with an oppressive aura. The sword intent contained in the edge of the sword was like an unsheathed divine weapon, carrying a sharpness that could penetrate the soul as it slashed towards Xinghui's spiritual world. Before the sword arrived, the sword intent arrived first. The sword intent that Xinghui cultivated from the Eastern Sun Sword mantra couldn't resist for more than half a breath before it collapsed. The divine weapon in Zhui Feng's hand whistled through the air. The three elements in the sword were perfectly combined, and through this sword, it could produce 3 times the power. Even though Xinghui reacted quickly and dodged quickly, he was still injured by Zhui Feng's sword light. The biting cold edge tore through his neck, leaving behind a trail of dark red blood. Too weak. You're no match for me just by relying on sword principle. Zhui Feng had already probed Xinghui's bottom line with one sword strike. He immediately withdrew his sword, as if about to return to the spiritual sword. Wait, the battle isn't over yet. Xinghui shouted loudly. At the same time, he stretched out his hand and wiped off the blood on his neck. In just a few moments, the wound caused by Zhui Feng had already begun to scab. This was the terrifying characteristic of a 10th order recovery ability. Flesh wounds like this could be easily healed. It's only a matter of time. Zhui Feng saw that Xinghui wasn't going to give up and wanted to continue the battle. He immediately twisted his body, and the biting cold sword light once again filled his spiritual world. Even though he immediately shouted and released the sword intent from the Eastern Sun Sword mantra in an attempt to resist Zhui Feng's sword intent, he was instantly defeated by Zhui Feng's sword intent. The moment his sword intent was defeated, his spirit was shaken, which naturally led to a series of stagnant qi and blood. Even though he tried his best to block Zhui Feng's sword, he was still powerless. He could only do his best to minimize the damage this sword brought to him. Qi. Blood splattered. Another sword wound appeared on Xinghui's shoulder. If he hadn't dodged in time, this sword strike would have cut off his entire arm and shoulder. Too weak. Your sword principle has never been refined into a whole. Sword intent is sword intent, qi and blood are qi and blood, and true qi is true qi. There's no connection between the three. Is this your sword principle? If this can be called sword principle, then I, Zhui Feng, am already standing at the peak of sword principle, a supreme master who has reached the peak. Zhui Feng stabbed out with his sword and shook his head. However, facing such a nagging sword spirit, Xinghui wasn't angry. Instead, his eyes flashed. Sword intent is sword intent, qi and blood are qi and blood, and true qi is true qi. They've never been refined into a whole? In other words, true sword principle requires the three to be one? Xinghui thought. He was someone who had raised his comprehension to the 5th level, so his mind worked very quickly. Soon he had thought of something. When Zhui Feng's third sword strike came at him again, he had already let out a roar. His qi and blood surged, and his true qi and spirit surged. At the same time, his spirit surged. Suddenly, the power of the originally ordinary sword intent rose sharply. Although it still couldn't block the power of Zhui Feng's sword intent, it bought him precious time, so that Zhui Feng's next sword strike only brushed past his body and didn't cause any serious damage. Is this all you can do after using all your strength? Your sword principle doesn't even have the qualifications to be a beginner. Sword principle is like crossing the sea. Sword intent is like a person, and sword qi is like a sail. As a ship, no matter how skilled the sailor is at sailing, if the ship's hull isn't solid and the sail isn't strong enough, how can it travel in the sea and reach the other side of the highest realm? As soon as Xue Feng finished speaking, a new sword light formed. Chapter 482. Ship. Sails. Sing Hui's level 5 comprehension lit up with countless sparks of inspiration when he heard Zhufeng's words. He was extremely talented in sword cultivation. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to enter the Eastern Sun Sword sect and master the Eastern Sun Sword Codex in just a few years. He also comprehended sword intent and was revered as a sword sage in the world of martial artists. Sing Hui had not continued to study the Eastern Sun Sword scripture during this period of time, and his cultivation of sword intent had embarked on the path of comprehending the Torch Dragon sword intent in the Condensed Light Sword. However, his accumulated experience had allowed him to gain an extremely deep understanding of the way of the sword. Now that he had been stimulated by Zhufeng, the sword intent in his mental world began to circulate spontaneously. As the Eastern Sun Sword intent gradually grew stronger, the Torch Dragon sword intent was immediately impacted and shaken, gradually collapsing. The way of the sword is like crossing the sea. The sword intent is like a person, and the sword chi is like a sail. As a ship, no matter how great a person's sailing skills are, without a sail, they will not be able to continue. With an empty ship, without a person to control it, without a sail to power it, it will still be unable to move. It's the same with an empty ship. Only when all three of these aspects reach the peak and work together wholeheartedly can one travel the sea smoothly and reach the other shore of the supreme realm. Sing Hui's mind was filled with inspiration. His voice was like a great bell, constantly reverberating in his mental world, causing it to rumble endlessly like an earthquake. At the core of his spiritual world, the shadow that belonged to the Torch Dragon sword intent was peeling off and collapsing layer by layer under the continuous vibration of the great bell. It was like a peerless divine weapon that was covered in rust, and under the vibration of the vast divine sound, all the rust was shaken off, thus revealing its true sharpness. The edge of a supreme sword. Buzz. Buzz. When the sword condensed in the spiritual world, the vital energy and blood within Qing Su's body were guided by the new sword intent involuntarily, fusing with the sword intent. At the same time, when all of his true essence was sealed up, the sword qi guided the vital energy and blood in his body involuntarily. It began to refine essence into qi, creating a new type of true qi that used the sword intent as a foundation. Generally speaking, before he had visualized the golden crow and the torch dragon to condense qi, but now he was condensing the supreme sword intent to condense qi. There seemed to be no difference, but in reality, however, the situation between the two had already changed silently. By visualizing the golden crow and the torch dragon, the cultivator's ultimate growth path was to transform into the golden crow and the torch dragon. The ultimate path of their cultivation was to transform into the real golden crow and the torch dragon. In other words, no matter how powerful they were, they could never surpass the real golden crow and the torch dragon. Even if they returned to their ancestors with the bloodline of the golden crow and the torch dragon, they still could not break through the shackles of the final bloodline. But at this moment, what guided his path of cultivation was no longer his bloodline, but the green ruins itself. It was the strand of sword intent he possessed, and this strand of sword intent originated from a cultivator's own will and worldview. No one knew where the ultimate achievement of this strand of sword intent lay, the way of the sword. Just as Zhu Feng was about to continue attacking and defeat Sing Hui, he seemed to sense the change in Sing Hui's aura. He suddenly stopped in his tracks, somewhat stunned. He stared blankly at Sing Hui, as if he had sensed something familiar from his body. Under the stimulation of this familiar feeling, he seemed to have thought of something. For a moment, he fell into a trance, staring at Sing Hui in a daze, not saying anything for a long time. The sword intent in Sing Hui's mental world continued to vibrate for an entire day. Fortunately, because he was already halfway up the myriad swords peak, no one could see his figure clearly if they did not fly on their swords. They did not know what he was doing on the mountain. They only felt that he was unwilling to give up and was still experiencing failure again and again. No one disturbed him along the way. When Tsing Hui's mental vibrations gradually stabilized, his gaze once again focused on the sword intent in his mental world that had completely merged with his own essence, qi, and spirit. Great success. Great success of sword intent. Even though it had not reached the peak of great success of the torch dragon sword intent, which was only half a step away from perfection, but this sword intent, it was completely condensed from his own essence, qi, and spirit, representing all the essence he had cultivated so far in the Dongyang sword manual. Even if the strength of the sword intent could not be compared to back then, when Tsing Hui commanded it, there was a feeling of blood and essence qi connected. Such a sword intent might be inferior to the torch dragon sword intent at the peak of great success in terms of strength, but if the two were suppressed to the essential qi, spirit refining realm, or even the unity of spirit and qi, Tsing Hui could completely rely on the perfect combination of this sword qi and his essence qi to crush the torch dragon sword intent with an absolute advantage. But it was not just crushing, it was fighting across realms. The Dongyang sword intent at the peak of the essential qi realm could defeat the torch dragon sword intent at the peak of great success in the spirit refining realm. Unbelievable. This is the true sword intent. A sword intent that completely belongs to me. My will is my Dao. This is my sword Dao. Tsing Hui clenched his fist. Under the vibration of the sword intent, he felt that all the swordsmanship he had cultivated could be twice or even several times more powerful at this moment. For a moment, Tsing Hui seemed to have thought of something, and his gaze immediately fell on the torch dragon sword intent. At that time, he felt something in his heart and fell into a strange state of enlightenment. All his attention was focused on the transformation of the Dongyang sword intent, and he did not notice the collapse of the torch dragon sword intent at all. So when his sword intent rushed to the peak of great success, the torch dragon sword intent had completely collapsed under the impact of his Dongyang sword intent. And the direct impact of the collapse of the torch dragon sword intent, the torch dragon divine soul dimmed, it even dimmed to the point that it had a tendency to collapse. Tsing Hui estimated that if he could not find a way to solve the collapse of the torch dragon sword intent in a few months, his torch dragon divine soul would completely dissipate. At that time, the torch dragon divine body that he had cultivated with great difficulty would also be annihilated and return to nothingness. Not only the torch dragon divine body, because his sword intent had already changed from the previous excavation of the Golden Crow and Torch Dragon bloodlines to the cultivation of his own sword intent by gathering his own essence, qi, and spirit. If he wanted to cultivate the Golden Crow bloodline to a higher realm in the future, he had to change the characteristics of his sword intent. From a sword intent that completely belonged to him to a sword intent that was close to the will of the Golden Crow divine beast. Otherwise, his Golden Crow bloodline cultivation would be severed. This kind of consequence made Tsing Hui's heart sink. The sword Dao required sincerity and purity, and this kind of exclusivity was too strong. Only I am supreme. Tsing Hui closed his eyes, and a trace of pain appeared on his face. This was a choice that was enough to torture people to collapse. When he stepped into this world in order to pursue power, he had already abandoned his passion for the sword Dao, but now, suddenly he'd gained sudden comprehension in the sword Dao and attained mastery in sword insight, and it had awakened his heart in the sword Dao once more. However, it just so happened that he had no choice but to face this cruel choice once more. Dream? Was he still going to lose to reality? He had already lost once. Did he need to lose a second time? Or perhaps, since he had already lost once, then the second failure didn't seem so intolerable anymore. And if he still succumbed to failure the second time, then the third, fourth, fifth, and even the countless times after that, would it still be far away? A trace of confusion flashed across Tsing Hui's painful expression. He couldn't see the path, couldn't see the future clearly. A brand new sword Dao, but I feel that this sword Dao is full of uncertainty. It seems to be a flash in the pan, and can be extinguished at any time, drowned in the dust of history. Just as Tsing Hui was tormented by this choice, a voice sounded. It was Zhu Feng. The sword spirit, Zhu Feng. Tsing Hui looked at the sword spirit in front of him. This strange existence that had existed for an unknown number of years also felt confused. Do you feel the same way? Confused, Zhu Feng lowered its head. Perhaps. Many times I do feel very confused. Just like right now, I don't know what the meaning of my existence is. Why am I staying here? Why do I have to draw my sword again and again when the trial takers come, even if some of them are weak and clumsy to the point of making me want to laugh? When it said this, Zhu Feng's face revealed a smile that didn't really look like a smile, because it had not smiled for too long. Because it had been too long since its kind could make it talk properly. Day after day, the cycle repeats itself. Zhu Feng stretched out its hand and grabbed at the void, as if it wanted to grab something. Was it the traces of time? Unfortunately, there was nothing left in its hand. Xing Hui fell silent. Thousands of years of confusion, compared to Zhu Feng, the torment and choice he was facing now seemed to be nothing. I'm very curious. If your willpower wasn't affected by this confusion, then how sharp would your sword intent, your sword edge, be affected? How could it be affected? Zhu Feng looked strangely at Xing Hui, and then he waved his hand in the air. It was not affected in the slightest. His sword intent was as sharp as ever. It was like a peerless divine weapon that had been hidden in its scabbard for dozens of years. Once it was unsheathed, even gods and ghosts would flee. Even though Xing Hui had already cultivated the sword intent derived from the Eastern Sun Sword Codex to great success, the essence of that sword intent still gave him a soul-stirring feeling. Your sword intent. I was very confused, and there were countless doubts in my heart. But, are these important? When I really need to draw my sword, I only need to put all my mind into my sword, use my sword, and wave it forward. I will use all my strength to display my sword intent. Whatever confusion, whatever doubts, at that moment, all of them will leave me. Only a carefree feeling exists in my mind. So, at that time, I only need to wave my sword. Wave my sword. I only need to wave my sword. Xing Hui could not help but think of the night when he had just comprehended sword intent in the Eastern Sun Sword sect. Yes, everything else was not important. He only needed to immerse all his mind into the sword in his hand, and then follow the original intention in his heart, and wave his sword. Xing Hui closed his eyes, and the experience of that night in the Eastern Sun Sword sect seemed to replay in his mind. Wave my sword. Wave my sword. Wave my sword. He enjoyed the joy of coming into contact with new sword techniques every day, enjoyed the joy of training until his entire body ached, enjoyed the carefree feeling of thrusting out sword after sword, and completely immersed his mind into the sword in his hand. Wave my sword. 10 swords, 100 swords, 300 swords, 1,000 swords. The traces of time gradually faded away from his body. All the distracting thoughts in his mind returned to the void. Wave my sword. And in front of him, watching him wave his sword again and again, Zhu Feng also seemed to be immersed in the trajectory of his sword, and his eyes once again became confused. No, this was not confusion. It was a kind of intoxication. What was intoxicated was not the sword intent that was triggered when he waved his sword, nor was it the sword technique that he displayed. It was a kind of spirit. A kind of spirit that was pure to the extreme. That kind of spirit was resplendent and dazzling, like a perfect and flawless gem, emitting a gaze that made any sword spirit unable to shift their eyes away. 3,000 swords, 10,000 swords, 30,000 swords, 100,000 swords. Gradually, Qin Yi, who had previously acknowledged Xing Hui, suddenly appeared. It just stood beside Zhu Feng, looking at Xing Hui, watching him wave his sword, looking at the extremely pure spirit on his body, as if it was looking at a rare treasure. Not long after, Tian Ke appeared, and not long after, Ting Shu'a also appeared. More and more sword spirits sensed this mysterious rhythm, and without needing Xing Hui to awaken them one by one, the sword spirits began to appear spontaneously, gathering beside Xing Hui. Looking at Xing Hui's sword techniques that did not have any moves to speak of, they were mesmerized. Buzz buzz. A sword spirit was stirred, and the body of the sword let out a crisp sword hum. The sword hum sounded as if it had broken some kind of shackle, and more spirit swords began to vibrate, and many of the sword spirits present softly let out long cries. 100 swords sang together. Chapter 483. It's been 3 days and he still hasn't come down? Since he doesn't have the ability to gain the recognition of those sword spirits, he might as well go down the mountain and waste our time. That's right. Sword cultivation isn't like ordinary cultivation methods. It requires one's own sword intent to be highly compatible with the will of the mythical beasts and sacred beasts that one has comprehended. The process can't be described with words. How can ordinary cultivation methods compare to it? Our hidden sword sect has spent hundreds and thousands of years, but there haven't been many sword experts who could gain the recognition of many sword spirits at the same time, let alone an outsider. He really won't give up until he sees the coffin. He's clearly been rejected by several sword spirits, but he's still unwilling to give up and shamelessly stays on the Myriad Sword's peak. Does he think that a miracle will happen? At the foot of the Myriad Sword's peak, the patience of the people who had been waiting for 3 days was getting worse and worse, especially when they saw that Xing Hui was unwilling to come down for a long time. The matter hadn't come to a conclusion yet, so their words were naturally filled with mockery and ridicule. It was as if their voices could reach the Myriad Sword's peak and disturb Xing Hui's performance, break his will, and make him give up on the Myriad Sword's peak. These people, why are they all like this? There was a trace of anger in Su Zhao's eyes. By belittling Mr. Yu Qing, they're showing their position and determination, hoping to curry favor with the North Moon Peak and Aurora Peak. They're just clowns. Su Tong glanced at the cultivators who were talking endlessly and coldly snorted. Before the result is out, we shouldn't give up hope. Su Xiao looked at the Myriad Sword's peak. At this time, Xing Hui had already disappeared into the undulating terrain of the Myriad Sword's peak, but there was still a trace of hope in her heart. Although she knew that the probability of her hope being realized was pitifully low, but, at the moment when the truth was not revealed, she was unwilling to give up. As if the heavens had heard Su Zhao's call, on the originally calm Myriad Sword's peak, streaks of spiritual light whizzed and shot in the same direction. At the same time, the sounds of swords began to reverberate on the Myriad Sword's peak. In just a moment, the sounds of swords chanting had become more and more frequent. Eventually, they connected into the clouds and resounded in the Myriad Sword's peak for a long time. The sudden change caused the impatient crowd to freeze on the spot. They could not help but widen their eyes and stare at the Myriad Sword's peak. 100 swords chant. 100 swords chant. This is the scene of 100 swords singing together. Oh my God, the rumors are true. There's actually someone who can get the approval of over 100 spiritual swords, thus producing the phenomenon of 100 swords chanting at the same time. Yu Qing? Is it the mysterious expert invited by the Divine Grace Merchant Guild? He did it. He actually did it. 100 swords chant at the same time. Oh my God, I can actually see the magnificent sight of 100 swords singing at the same time. After being stunned for a moment, a burst of uncontrollable exclamations broke out from the crowd. Everyone was shouting at the spectacular scene in front of them. As for those cultivators who had mocked and ridiculed Xing Hui earlier, they were all ashamed and hid in the crowd, not daring to show their faces. Even though they were all looking at the spectacular scene of hundreds of swords chanting at the same time on Myriad Sword's peak, they were all extremely shocked. Did he succeeded? Su Xiao looked at the changes on Myriad Sword's peak and was stunned for a moment. Even though she had been fantasizing about this scene for a month, when the scene of 100 swords chanting at the same time really appeared in front of her, she still could not believe it. The scene in front of her was like a dream. It was so unreal. Mr. Yu Qing, he actually, not only Su Xiao, but Su Tong also widened her eyes at the scene in front of her. However, Xing Lian, Si Tongzhen, Elder Jin Yin, and the rest could not help but cheer at this moment. That's great, he succeeded. Mr. Yu Qing succeeded. 100 swords chant at the same time. He did it. How is it possible? Compared to the shocked cheers of the crowd and the Divine Grace Merchant Guild, who were overjoyed at the birth of a peerless sword genius, the experts from the North Moon Peak, Aurora Peak, and even the Hidden Sword Peak were all shocked at the same time. They stared at Myriad Sword's peak with eyes full of disbelief. 100 swords chant at the same time. It's really the 100 Swords chant at the same time. That Yu Qing. He actually caused the 100 Swords chant at the same time? How can he do something that the Hidden Sword sect has not been able to do for hundreds of years? Damn it, we're in big trouble now. 100 Swords chant at the same time. Will it alarm the Hidden Sword Venerable? It's actually the 100 Swords chant at the same time. The rumors that have been passed down from the Myriad Swords Peak are actually true? This is bad. Yu Qing was invited by the Divine Grace Merchant Guild. Now that the 100 Swords chant at the same time has alarmed the Hidden Sword Venerable, he only needs to tell the Hidden Sword Venerable about this and we will definitely be punished by him. Amidst the shock, the people on the North Moon Peak, Aurora Peak, and Hidden Sword Peak were already in a mess. Among them, the North Moon Peak's Peak Master Mu Sheng-yi, Great Elder Bei Shentong, and the rest had a cold glint in their eyes. While the 100 Swords chant at the same time is still short and the Hidden Sword Venerable hasn't been alarmed, let's strike right now and kill Yu Qing like a bolt of lightning. No matter how outstanding a sword genius he is, as long as we can kill him, I believe the Hidden Sword Venerable won't completely fall out with our North Moon Peak or the heavenly ways behind the North Moon Peak for a dead sword genius. Bei Shentong made up his mind immediately. He turned to North Moon Xian and said, I'll heavily injure Yu Qing in a while, and you'll kill the final assassin. You have the Scarlet Mystery Dao Lord behind you, so no matter how furious the Hidden Sword Venerable is, he'll never be bold enough to kill you. Alright. North Moon Xian glanced at Su Shao from the Divine Grace Merchant Guild. His eyes were cold as he agreed without any hesitation at all. Do it. Bei Shentong called out. His presence was about to erupt as well. However, the moment he released his aura, in the forbidden grounds of the Hidden Sword sect that was over 100 kilometers away, another aura that was vast, ancient, profound, and majestic suddenly rose up. In an instant, it shot straight into the clouds, stirring up the wind and clouds, causing the clouds above the mountain to be torn apart in one fell swoop, forming a huge whirlpool that was over 60 kilometers in diameter. Once the terrifying aura appeared, it immediately brought with it a vast and suffocating pressure. It rolled over and directly descended above the Myriad Swords Peak. It was a terrifying pressure that enveloped everything within 100 kilometers. It was so powerful that no one had the courage to attack. It instantly made Bei Shentong, the great elder of the North Moon Peak, who had already activated his Zhenyuan and was about to attack, feel cold all over. His eyes widened in shock as he stared in the direction of the aura. His eyes were filled with uncontrollable shock and fear. It's the Hidden Sword Venerable. It's the Hidden Sword Venerable. Mu Shengyi trembled all over as his voice trembled. He had already been scared out of his wits. The Hidden Sword Venerable. He's actually still alive. Everyone's guess was wrong. The Lord of the Aurora Peak, Lu Xiangyang, paled slightly. Even the Golden Core elders of the Hidden Sword Peak's main branch all became solemn. When they thought of what they had done in the Hidden Sword sect during this period of time, they immediately had a bad feeling. The Hidden Sword Venerable. The Hidden Sword Venerable. This is the presence of the Hidden Sword Venerable. That's great. I knew Master Hidden Sword Venerable would be fine. The Hidden Sword Venerable has emerged. Hidden Sword Venerable sensed the 100 Swords chant and came out of seclusion. That's great. Hasn't there always been a rumor that the great Hidden Sword Venerable has died of old age in seclusion? Look, who still dares to say that the Hidden Sword Venerable has died of old age? Hiss. What a terrifying aura. 100 years ago, I personally sensed the presence of the Hidden Sword Venerable. At that time, his aura shouldn't have been so strong, right? But now, the Hidden Sword Venerable has only revealed his presence, but the pressure that it brings is so strong that I can't even think of resisting it. Could it be that the Hidden Sword Venerable's cultivation has broken through again? Compared to the North Moon Peak, Aurora Peak, and even the Hidden Sword Peak who were so shocked that they kept quiet out of fear, the other cultivators of the Hidden Sword sect erupted into uncontrollable cheers at the same time. The Hidden Sword Venerable Aunt Tong, did you feel it? Such a powerful presence, it's definitely the Hidden Sword Venerable's Grandmaster. Grandmaster is fine, he's fine. In the direction of the Xinhui Chamber of Commerce, Su Xiao couldn't help but jump up and down in joy when the hidden sword venerable's presence appeared. She was no longer as calm as before as she pulled Su Tong and jumped up and down in joy. Xing Lian, Si Tongzhen, Jin Yin, and even Su Tong were filled with surprise and joy. Even though they had already predicted that Mr. Yu Qing's hymn of 100 swords would definitely draw out the hidden sword venerable, they still could not help but want to cry out loudly to vent their joy when they personally sensed the hidden sword venerable's presence. The hidden sword venerable. Bei Shentong's shocked gaze paused in the hidden sword venerable's direction for a while. As if he thought of something, his gaze suddenly landed on North Moon Xian. His gaze seemed to contain a sliver of uncontrollable shock. When North Moon Xian sensed Bei Shentong's questioning gaze, he sucked in a deep breath and nodded firmly. His expression was extremely ugly. The aura that the hidden sword venerable has demonstrated this time is indeed no weaker than my master's. It's true. With North Moon Xian's confirmation, Bei Shentong was mildly surprised. Afterwards, he was like a punctured balloon, immediately withering away. A large chunk of his vital energies seemed to have been sucked away. Bei Shentong was the greatest expert in the hidden sword sect, second only to the hidden sword venerable. If it were not for the fact that the heavens had sworn the hidden sword venerable was dead and were willing to give him the resources to complete a high-grade golden core and even let the sect master of the Scarlet Mystery sect take in their most outstanding junior, North Moon Xian, as a disciple, why would he betray the hidden sword venerable and betray the interests of the hidden sword sect to side with the heavens? But now, not only was the hidden sword venerable still alive, but his cultivation had broken through again, becoming even more powerful than before. And in the past few years, he had caused countless losses to the hidden sword sect. Chapter 484. Xing Hui's state of epiphany lasted for 10 days. Due to the suppression of hidden sword venerable's aura, his 10 days of cultivation could be said to be peaceful. He could freely express the suppression and understanding of sword Dao that he had suppressed over the years. When he woke up from the mysterious state of epiphany, his sword Dao naturally broke through to the perfect level. When the conditions were right, success would follow naturally. It was easy. Walking on the bloodline cultivation path, his talent was twice the work for half the result. He relied on the chaotic level and various Taoist rhymes to comprehend sword Dao, however, it allowed him to get twice the result with half the effort. It was as if the game that was originally in hell mode had suddenly changed to easy mode. The rapid growth made him somewhat stunned. As Xing Hui woke up from his epiphany, the spirituality of the many sword spirits on Myriad Sword's peak gradually dissipated. After a while, they returned to their respective spiritual swords and fell into silence again. The difference was that their spirituality was stronger than before. Experiencer. A voice echoed in Xing Hui's ears. It was the sword spirit, Zhu Feng. Xing Hui's gaze fell on the sword spirit. You've received our approval. After Zhu Feng finished speaking, he bowed slightly to Xing Hui. Can you tell me your name? My name is Xing Hui. Xing Hui. There was a sliver of satisfaction in Zhu Feng's eyes. I will remember that in the journey of my life that I don't have many memories of, a swordsman called Qing Su gave me a rare experience of sword intent. It's my honor. Zhu Feng nodded. In the next moment, its spirituality dissipated. It had turned into a stream of light and entered the spiritual sword. Xing Hui's gaze paused on Zhu Feng for a moment. He raised his head slightly and looked in a direction that was hundreds of kilometers away. There, he could feel a strong and suffocating aura. This aura was so strong that even the remnant sword of the Almighty's true body could not be compared to it, let alone the Black Heaven Taoist master that he encountered back then. Little friend, would you like to take a trip to my burial sword peak? As Xing Hui looked in the direction of the aura seemed to have sensed that Xing Hui had completed his epiphany. Its voice suddenly rang out in the void. My pleasure. Xing Hui nodded and flew up on his sword, heading straight in the direction of the aura. As for the fact that the Torch Dragon's soul was on the verge of collapse due to the breakthrough of his sword intent, he couldn't care too much about it for the time being. He's out. Mr. Yu Qing is out. Tsing Hui flew out of the myriad sword's peak on his sword. Many cultivators who were still guarding the foot of the mountain suddenly exclaimed in surprise. This direction. Mr. Yuqing is heading towards the burial sword peak where the hidden sword venerable is in seclusion. He was indeed summoned by the hidden sword venerable. Divine Grace Merchant Guild Su Xiao couldn't help but ask excitedly, will he tell Hidden Sword Venerable about the unfair treatment our Divine Grace Merchant Guild received? He definitely will, Su Tong said firmly. Su Tong said with conviction. In the end, she glanced in the direction of the North Moon Peak. Can't you see that everyone at the North Moon Peak is in a state of panic right now? They've been trying to make up for their mistakes in the past 10 days. North Moon Peak? Su Xiao glanced in the direction of the North Moon Peak. In the past 10 days, many people from the North Moon Peak had left. Most of them were trying to think of a way to deal with the Hidden Sword Venerable's reprimand. There were even some people who secretly found her, the president of the Divine Grace Merchant Guild, and expressed that the North Moon Peak was willing to apologize for what they had done to the Divine Grace Merchant Guild during this period of time. They hoped that the Divine Grace Merchant Guild could forgive the North Moon Peak. For the North Moon Peak to beg the Divine Grace Merchant Guild in such a humble manner was something that had never happened before during this period of time. They won't be happy for long. Tsing Hui's mind was no longer on the internal affairs of the Hidden Sword sect. He did not find it strange that the Hidden Sword Venerable was still alive. After all, even if an Almighty had lived for almost 3,000 years, he would have taken many heavenly treasures to extend his life. It was not surprising that he was still alive. At this moment, what he really wanted to know the most was the 10,000 Swords Peak. What secrets did the 10,000 Swords Peak hold? And the many sword spirits on the 10,000 Swords Peak, why did they exist? These questions could only be answered after meeting Hidden Sword Venerable and asking Hidden Sword Venerable in person. To Tsing Hui, 100 kilometers was easily traversed in less than half an hour. As he pressed down on the sword light, he directly landed on the mountain where the Hidden Sword Venerable lived. When he landed on the mountain, he discovered that the entire mountain was sealed by a tyrannical and cold sword intent. Although this sword intent was completely different from the sword intent that Tsing Hui had comprehended this time, it was born from visualizing the white tiger. However, the killing power contained within was enough to kill any Golden Core stage expert who easily stepped into it. It was precisely because of the protection of this formation that even though the sect master of the Hidden Sword sect and the elders of the Golden Core stage wanted to know if the Hidden Sword Venerable was safe and sound, they still did not dare to step onto the burial sword peak to investigate. However, at this moment, the sword formation on the mountain had already left a path. As Tsing Hui followed this path and landed on the burial sword peak, the sword formation once again sealed off the burial sword peak. In a courtyard of the Hidden Sword Peak, an old man who looked rather old and was filled with an ancient and decaying aura was looking at him with a smile on his face. When I sensed the aura on your body, I guessed that you shouldn't be that old. That kind of vitality can't be faked. However, when I saw you in person, I discovered that you're actually even younger than I imagined. You're truly a heaven-sent genius. The old man looked at Tsing Hui and praised him from the bottom of his heart. Tsing Hui did not need any introduction to recognize the old man in front of him. He immediately stepped forward and bowed slightly, "Greetings to the Hidden Sword Venerable. No need for formalities, please take a seat." The Hidden Sword Venerable gestured with his hand and invited Tsing Hui into a small pavilion in the courtyard. Tsing Hui also sized up the Hidden Sword Venerable with a hint of surprise in his eyes. He could sense that the sword intent that the Hidden Sword Venerable emitted faintly formed a strong pressure on him. This pressure did not only come from the nature of his sword intent, but also from his mental strength level. With the combination of these two factors, even Tsing Hui's perfect sword intent was inferior to his. However, what really surprised him was the energy ripples on the Hidden Sword Venerable's body. That energy ripple, it was not even comparable to the Golden Core stage incarnation of the Black Heaven Taoist Master, let alone the broken sword of a newly ascended Almighty. This was not in line with the terrifying aura that the Hidden Sword Venerable had unleashed earlier. Was the aura not proportional to his strength? Or was he unable to see through it because his cultivation was too low? Young friend, you can see through it? The hidden sword venerable noticed that Sing Hui's expression was strange and answered rather casually. Sword venerable? The hidden sword venerable nodded slightly. You're right. I'm indeed not in the divine realm. Sing Hui frowned. The hidden sword venerable was already a powerful figure 1,000 years ago. Even if he did not make any progress in the past 1,000 years, his cultivation should not have regressed and become a golden core cultivator. It's very simple. I've recultivated. The hidden sword venerable said calmly as if he was talking about something unimportant. However, the information in his words made Sing Hui's heart skip a beat. He immediately thought of the problem that his torch dragon divine body and golden crow divine body were facing. Sword venerable, you're saying that you've given up your divine realm cultivation and switched to the sword Dao. Divine realm, the hidden sword venerable shook his head. I've already broken through to the lawful embodiment of heaven and earth 100 years ago. Lawful embodiment of heaven and earth. The hidden sword venerable nodded slightly. After that, I came into contact with the essence of the sword Dao by chance. 60 years ago, I made up my mind to abandon my cultivation and switch to the sword Dao. Phew. Sing Hui heaved a long sigh of relief when he heard the news. A great figure at the peak of the Saint Realm was equivalent to the strongest Dao Lord in the Heaven Dao, yet he was actually willing to abandon his cultivation at the peak of perfection to cultivate in the sword Dao? Such determination, Sing Hui was filled with respect. At this moment, he also vaguely understood why the hidden sword venerable had not died, but why he still watched the Grand Supreme, Aurora Peak and North Moon Peak, which were supported by the heavenly axiom, abuse their power in his hidden sword sect. It was because, after giving up his divine realm cultivation, he no longer had that kind of power. Rather than that, he might as well hide behind the scenes and intimidate the North Moon Peak and the Aurora Peak. At the very least, the North Moon Peak and the Aurora Peak would not dare to cross the line. Don't look at me like I'm a martyr. The hidden sword venerable smiled when he saw the change in Sing Hui's expression. Actually, things aren't as bad as you think. Sing Hui thought about the powerful sword essence that the hidden sword venerable released earlier. Moreover, he did not think that the hidden sword venerable was someone who would act rashly without considering the consequences. He said in a deep voice, I'd like to hear the details. Even though I abandoned my divine ability and chose to cultivate in the sword Dao, but the outcome isn't as bad as you imagine. If I'm fast in 1 or 2 years, and if I'm slow in 8 or 10 years, my sword Dao will return to its peak in a completely new state and blossom with boundless brilliance. As the hidden sword venerable said that, his gaze landed on Qing Su. Originally, I didn't plan on showing myself so early. After all, I only have a few years left before I reach major achievement in the way of the sword. However, through the hymn of 100 swords, I really don't want to see a genius of the way of the sword like you end up like me, walking down the wrong path again and wasting your youth for nothing. As a result, I came out of seclusion early and summoned you. I hope that I won't be the only one walking down the path of the way of the sword in the future. Sing Hui was suddenly enlightened. He bowed deeply to the hidden sword venerable and said, Hidden sword venerable, please enlighten me. Of course, this is why I called you here. The venerable of the hidden sword looked at Qing Su and spoke with a sliver of irrepressible excitement. He was like a traveler who had traveled through the desert alone for several decades. He did not know day or night, direction, or the future. After being tormented by this loneliness for decades, he suddenly saw a creature like himself, and could not wait to tell it about all his experiences over the years. The sword way that truly existed in the ancient times is not the one we imagined. It has a completely different form, and the power it possesses is far beyond our imagination. Even though I have only seen a small step forward, I believe that if I can really demonstrate this small step of the sword way that I saw, the light that will bloom will definitely amaze the entire infinite wasteland domain. Chapter 485. The Way of the Sword from the Ancient Times. Tsing Hui's way of the killing sword was said to have originated from the ancient times. The ancient times that I'm talking about are much older than the ancient times that you know of. It was a time so long ago that there were no records of it. At that time, heaven and earth were in harmony, yin and yang were in harmony, trees were everywhere, palaces were connected, celestial birds were flying, and there was an ancient creature called the Celestial. It was immortal and could travel with the wind, gathering to discuss the Tao. This time should be traced back to before the divine wilderness. Before the divine wilderness, from what Tsing Hui knew, the ancient divine wilderness was destroyed by many powerful people 10,000 years ago. It was shattered into a boundless land with Tianhuang as the center. There were many islands like Eastern Wilderness, Chongzhen, and Hidden Sword. They were just one of the many islands that were destroyed in the divine wilderness. As for the information before the divine wilderness was destroyed, he had not heard of it. After all, even if there were sects that survived the destruction of the divine wilderness, there would be very little information left behind after the catastrophe. Before the divine wilderness, even the ancient times that belonged to the divine wilderness, Hidden Sword Venerable's eyes flashed and he was happy with his discovery. According to the information that I've gathered and the conversations with the sword spirits on the Myriad Sword Peak, I've come up with a new way of the sword. It's a way of the sword that is not inferior to the way of the bloodline. After he finished speaking, Hidden Sword Venerable waved his hand and a sword aura formed in his hand. In just a moment, it turned into a peerless divine sword. As soon as the sword appeared, Qing Su immediately felt life-threatening danger. Just a glance at the sword was enough to make his heart palpitate. The destructive power within the sword had completely exceeded the limits of the power he had been aiming for all these years. Especially, on this divine sword, he saw the shadow of a black tiger. It was as if it was carved on the divine sword. It was very lifelike, as if it was alive. This sword, this is my destiny divine sword. It's called the Hidden Edge Sword. It's level 12. Level 12. Tsing Hui thought of the condensing light sword. Can a level 12 divine sword be this powerful? A 12th grade divine sword naturally can't have this kind of power, but the vault sheath in my hand can't be measured by a 12th grade divine sword at all. It's the vessel of my divine ability and battle constitution. The carrier of my divine powers and battle body? That's right. Hidden Sword Saint smiled and said, all this time, we have been cultivating the sword Tao because of the bloodline of godly beasts and saint beasts. Even the sword Tao that was passed down from the godly desolate era still revolves around godly beasts and saint beasts. No matter how powerful they are just supplements for the bloodline of godly beasts and saint beasts. Through the constant contact with the sword spirits on the 10,000 Swords Peak and the ancient knowledge that I have learned, I have found a new cultivation direction for us sword Tao cultivators 100 years ago. It is a cultivation direction that is more suitable for me and for those who seek the sword Tao. If this cultivation direction is correct, our cultivation will no longer be limited by the bloodline of godly beasts and saint beasts. Even those who cultivate the bloodline of godly beasts and saint beasts can break their own limits and reach the highest level. Tsing Hui seemed to have thought of something. His eyes fell on the black tiger engraving on Hidden Edge Sword and a bolt of lightning flashed in his heart. Hidden Sword Venerable, the bloodline that you have awakened, you're right. The Black Tiger bloodline. The Black Tiger bloodline. Hidden Sword Venerable admitted in a self-deprecating manner. Spiritual beasts. Although spirit beasts could grow to the peak of the saint realm, they had to be the best among spirit beasts, or a close relative of a saint beast who had a part of the bloodline of a saint beast. Generally, the upper limit of a spirit beast's growth was often the golden core realm, especially when they were close to the bloodline shackles. The resources that a spirit beast bloodline cultivator needed to spend were several times that of a saint beast or even a divine beast bloodline cultivator. Hidden Sword Venerable was able to use the bloodline of the spiritual beasts to reach the almighty realm. Later on, he even reached the lawful embodiment of heaven and earth. What kind of talent, and perseverance did he have? Unfortunately, it was precisely because of the existence of the bloodline shackles that the lawful embodiment of heaven and earth had become a nightmare that he could never break through. He would be trapped in the lawful embodiment of heaven and earth for the rest of his life, and he could forget about having any extravagant hope of breaking through. Xing Hui guessed that this might be the reason why he was willing to devote all his attention to the way of the sword. He was looking for another way out. His way out was not to pursue the way of the sword, but power. This was the reason why Hidden Sword Venerable was not able to trigger the hymn of 100 swords back then. I've sealed my soul, my flesh, and my abilities into my natal sword, the Hidden Edge Sword. I've also refined the Hidden Edge Sword into my body. Hidden Sword Venerable looked at the Hidden Edge Sword in his hand. The aura on the Hidden Edge Sword was tumbling and the power it contained was earth-shattering. Once it was unleashed, it would not be inferior to the divine powers of the Almighty. If he really merged his natal sword with his divine powers, then the power of this divine sword would be able to kill a divine being. Divine soul, body, divine powers. Is this a sacrifice to the sword? Xing Hui was silent. Sacrifice to the sword? This is not a sacrifice to the sword, but a protection to the sword. We cultivators cultivate the way of the sword. Just the passion for the sword is not enough. We also need a powerful force to protect us in the process of cultivating and comprehending the way of the sword. This method of refining the divine soul, body, and divine powers into the sword is the protection method I created. Protection method? That's right. What is the core of the natal sword? This divine sword is connected to your own sword intent, and the sword intent is the fusion of your spirit and your beliefs. It is the core of your way of the sword. Unfortunately, the core of the way of the sword doesn't have a powerful protective force. The sword chi and sword techniques derived from it are far from comparable to the divine beast battle bodies and the various divine abilities. You pursue the way of the sword, but you don't have a protective force. You can only watch as the geniuses who have dedicated their lives to the way of the sword are crushed into dust by the battle bodies. This kind of way of the sword, in my opinion, is incomplete. So, I combined what I have learned and created this protective method for us sword cultivators. Fusing the battle bodies, the divine soul, and the power of divine abilities into the natal divine sword. Once the natal divine sword is forged, when the natal sword venerable finished speaking, an unprecedentedly powerful aura rose from his body. I can kill saints. Xing Hui looked at the natal sword venerable in Hidden Sword Venerable's hand that had not completely transformed. Kill saints. This was not an empty promise. However, when a cultivator's divine powers, and divine powers are all fused into the natal sword venerable. Without the protection of divine powers and divine powers, the cultivator will be extremely weak. Even you, Hidden Sword Venerable, can't withstand the attack of a golden core cultivator. How are you going to protect yourself? Protect myself? Hidden Sword Venerable said arrogantly, why do you need to protect yourself? He looked at Xing Hui and asked, do you know what a real swordsman's strongest defense is? Xing Hui was silent for a moment. Then he looked up and said, attack. That's right. Hidden Sword Venerable raised his hand and slashed forward as if he was going to cut the void in front of him in half. A real swordsman's strongest defense is his attack. Attack again. Attack like fire and attack like thunder. Why should we defend when the enemy attacks us with divine powers? We just need to attack. Attack again. Shatter all of the enemy's attacks. Techniques? Divine powers? Battle body? Divine weapons? Rare treasures? I have a sword that can break all attacks. This is our defense. This is the strongest defense of a swordsman. Attack is the best defense. Xing Hui immediately understood Hidden Sword Venerable's thoughts. By fusing divine powers, and divine powers into the natal sword venerable, he might be so weak that a golden core cultivator could kill him, a phenomenon of heaven and earth cultivator. However, as long as his attack was strong enough, as long as his attack was fast enough, any attack of his enemy would be destroyed by his sword before it could hit him. How could all the techniques, constitutions, weapons, and treasures in the world hurt him at all? This was the sword Tao that Hidden Sword Venerable had learned. This was why Hidden Sword Venerable dared to claim that he could kill a divine being. Of course, killing a saint was one thing, and killing a saint was another. He might be able to tear apart a saint's domain with a single strike of his sword, but he might not be able to shatter it with a single strike. As long as that saint pulled back and avoided his attack, the power of the domain would sweep over him, and he, who was weak and fragile, would be reduced to ashes. Ultimate Tao, Xing Hui murmured to himself. Sword Tao is the ultimate Tao. Hidden Sword Venerable continued Xing Hui's words and said, abandoning defense, abandoning all transformations, and even sacrificing one's own life to turn everything one has into an attack. This is the Sword Tao that I understand. I call it the ultimate Sword Tao. At this point, his tone was slightly low, but his voice contained a vast power that shook one's heart. Perhaps in this way, we won't be able to create protective talismans, we won't be able to transform our vital energy into bodies, we won't be able to transform endlessly, and we won't be able to live forever. But at least, we'll be able to forge a sword, an indestructible sword, a sword that can break through anything, a sword that is invincible, a sword that will be able to stun everything in the world as long as it's unsheathed. Ultimate Sword. Xing Hui's right hand, which he always used to hold his sword, trembled slightly. He felt that something in his heart was gradually awakening. Ultimate Sword. Hidden Sword Venerable nodded heavily. The core of this cultivation method is whether the natal legendary sword can carry the power of the divine being, the battle body, and the divine being. The natal legendary sword is the combination of the divine being and the sword intent. Is your sword intent strong enough to suppress the various powers in the natal legendary sword and make it willingly protect you? My sword will is incomplete, and the Tao of divine ability has been deeply rooted in my mind for thousands of years. Thus, I spent 60 years, but I was unable to completely suppress the Tao of divine ability, the Tao of divine ability, and the Tao of divine ability that had fused into the hidden edge sword and fused them into my natal sword. However, you are different. You have only cultivated for a short period of time, and your mind has yet to form that supreme bloodline and spiritual consciousness. Furthermore, your sword will is so powerful that it can cause 100 swords to hum at the same time. Thus, you are the best successor to my Tao of Sword. Chapter 486. Successor. Xing Hui raised his head and looked at Hidden Sword Venerable. The Hidden Sword Venerable looked at Qing Su at this moment. There was a sliver of gratification from making friends with the same kind in his eyes, as well as a sliver of anticipation for his future. My current accomplishments are already the limit. I'm too old, and I've been affected too deeply by my supreme bloodline. If I make a breakthrough as I strengthen my sword and reach sainthood, I can't guarantee that my sword intent will still be able to suppress my abilities, body, and soul after I understand how powerful sainthood experts are. I can't guarantee that my sword intent will still be able to suppress my abilities, body, and soul after I understand how powerful sainthood experts are. I can't guarantee that I'll give up on the way of the sword and cultivate my bloodline again. However, you're different. You're very young, very young. Youth means unparalleled malleability. In particular, your sword intent gives you a unique advantage when it comes to refining your bloodline and abilities. As a result, as long as you persist, you'll be able to surpass me one day and truly stand at the peak of the world, announcing to the world that I'm the supreme way of the sword. If that day comes, I, Hidden Sword Venerable, will die with no regrets, giving up all means in exchange for an extremely powerful attack. The ultimate sword. Xing Hui's mind was filled with thoughts. The ultimate sword's advantage was obvious. A life-bound sword born from a transcendent realm cultivation was already enough to make him invincible in the saint realm in terms of offense. If the energy within the life-bound sword reached the level of lawful embodiment of heaven and earth, it could even slay saints. Xing Hui's foundation was stronger than Hidden Sword Venerable's. If he used a divine ability or even a supreme divine ability to nurture his sword, the pure power of his attack would be even stronger. He would be able to threaten saints the moment his divine ability was formed. If he used a supreme divine ability to nurture his sword, it would be possible for it to have the power to kill gods. But the disadvantages were also obvious. There were no transformations, no additional techniques, and their defenses were so weak that they could be threatened by cultivators in the Golden Core realm or below. Once they were hit by the divine ability of a transcendent realm expert, they would die if they were hit, and be injured if they were touched. But these disadvantages were not unavoidable. Immortal body, backtracking. This was a unique advantage that he had gained by borrowing the power of the Chaos Temple. Even Hidden Sword Venerable was no match for him. Therefore, compared to Hidden Sword Venerable, he was more suitable for the ultimate sword principle. Besides, Xing Hui thought of the way of the sword and the way of the bloodline. Between the two, he clearly preferred the former. If the way of the sword was his life's dream, then previously, it was because the dream had to be built on the foundation of reality. Without the economic foundation to survive, how could he give up everything to pursue his dream? And now, the ultimate sword Dao was equivalent to giving him a sufficient financial foundation to pursue his dreams. If he still chose to put down the sword in his hand under such circumstances, how can I cultivate Hidden Sword Venerable's ultimate sword Dao? Xing Hui said solemnly. If you want to learn, I'll teach you. Hidden Sword Venerable said with a smile. Qing Su took 3 steps back before standing before the Hidden Sword Venerable. He bowed towards the Hidden Sword Venerable seriously. Please teach me, Hidden Sword Venerable. Alright. There were no conditions and there was no hesitation. Hidden Sword Venerable agreed without hesitation. In the next moment his eyes lit up. A powerful sword essence that contained endless information shot out from his spiritual world and rushed into Xing Hui's spiritual world. Then, it exploded in Xing Hui's spiritual world. It carried with it a vast amount of information and countless mysteries that bloomed in his spiritual world. Xing Hui did not hesitate when he received the information. He immediately closed his eyes and focused on comprehending the sword essence. Hidden Sword Venerable was comforted when he saw that Lin Huang had absolute trust in him. However, what Hidden Sword Venerable did not know was that Xing Hui did not guard against him. Instead, it was that he was still in the backtrack skill and was not afraid of death. It took Xing Hui an entire day to digest the information that Hidden Sword Venerable had given him. Not only did the information include the conversion method for the ultimate way of the sword, but it also included the various experiences the Hidden Sword Venerable had gone through in the past 60 years. The Hidden Sword Venerable had passed everything to Qing Su without holding anything back. These experiences were invaluable to him. They would allow him to take a lot of detours. After digesting the information, Xing Hui opened his eyes again and bowed to Hidden Sword Venerable. Thank you, Hidden Sword Venerable. It's a pity that I'm old. This is the end of my life. I don't think I'll be able to live for long if I convert to the ultimate sword Dao. Otherwise, I'd be able to teach you more things in the future. 100 Swords chant. This is the first time we've seen such a genius in the sword Dao since the Hidden Sword sect was founded. I really want to know what kind of achievements such a genius in the sword Dao will have. I'm sure Hidden Sword Venerable will be able to see it. Thank you for your kind words. Hidden Sword Venerable said as he looked at Xing Hui, because you've comprehended the pure sword essence, your original sword essence has collapsed, right? In order to not affect the divine beast bloodline that you cultivate, you should quickly choose your natal divine sword and refine all of this power into your natal divine sword. Natal Holy Sword, Xing Hui nodded. In the cultivation of extreme sword Dao, sword intent was the most important, but the natal divine swords used to carry the Gold Crow Divine Body, Torch Dragon Divine Body, Gold Crow Divine Soul, and Torch Dragon Divine Soul were equally important. If the natal divine swords were not strong enough to carry enough power, he would have to spend a lot of energy to refine them, so as to prevent them from limiting the power of the Gold Crow and Torch Dragon bloodlines. I have a variety of materials I prepared when I changed my cultivation all those years ago, and it includes some materials to refine swords. You can take them if you need them. Besides that, you ought to understand that when you fuse the bloodline of a divine beast into your origin sword, the more peaceful the bloodline of the divine beast is, the easier it is to fuse it, and vice versa. Amongst the various stages of cultivation in the Saint Realm, the Golden Core Realm is the most peaceful. In this realm, the power of the Golden Core Realm is as harmonious as one and is prepared for the creation of divine powers. If you can refine your natal holy sword as a Golden Core Realm cultivator, it will be much easier for you. Golden Core Realm. Xing Hui shook his head when he heard this. Too many resources are needed to form a Golden Core. Even an inferior-grade Golden Core requires a lot of resources, especially since I have a Divine-grade Battle Body and Divine-grade Vital Essence. Once I form a Golden Core, it will be a superior-grade Golden Core. Correspondingly, I will need a lot of resources to form an inferior-grade or superior-grade Golden Core. Resources? Hidden Sword Venerable said with a faint smile. The Hidden Sword sect has ruled the Hidden Sword continent for thousands of years. Over the years, we have accumulated a lot of resources. In addition, 100 years ago, I planned to use my second Golden Core to carry my natal holy sword, so I deliberately collected resources to refine my Golden Core. Unfortunately, I later found out that the method to carry my natal holy sword with my second Golden Core was not usable, so I collected all these resources. Although these resources are not much, they are enough for you to form a superior-grade Golden Core. Xing Hui was slightly stunned by Hidden Sword Venerable's words. The Hidden Sword sect was the supreme overlord of the Hidden Sword continent. The entire Hidden Sword continent was dominated by the Hidden Sword sect. As the strongest member of the Hidden Sword sect, if the Hidden Sword Venerable wanted to collect resources, the power that he could use was far beyond what ordinary people could compare to. Although it was difficult to accumulate resources for hundreds of years to condense a high-grade Golden Core, it was still barely possible. However, Xing Hui had inherited Hidden Sword Venerable's ultimate sword art. If he took these resources, he would not be able to accept them. Hidden Sword Venerable seemed to understand Xing Hui's thoughts. He pondered for a while and said, "These resources were gathered by the Hidden Sword sect after hundreds of years of hard work. If I just gave them to you, even as the founder of the Hidden Sword sect, I would feel sorry for the disciples of the Hidden Sword sect. How about this? I hope that you can become the supreme elder of the Hidden Sword sect. When you have enough power, you will be able to protect the Hidden Sword sect. Also, in the next 100 years, you will need to take in a disciple and teach him." As the supreme elder of the Hidden Sword sect, Xing Hui looked at Hidden Sword Venerable and said, "I don't think I will be staying in the Hidden Sword sect for long in the future." "I understand. I just hope that when the Hidden Sword sect is in trouble and asks you for help, you will help the Hidden Sword sect." "I promise." Xing Hui agreed. At the same time, he was confused. "Hidden Sword Venerable, you are about to switch to the way of the sword. When that time comes, you will be strong enough to dominate the Saint Realm. With your power, you will be able to protect the Hidden Sword sect." "Why?" Hidden Sword Venerable shook his head. "If I can cultivate my natal spiritual sword in 3 to 5 years and fuse it with my cultivation, I will be able to improve greatly." "But," the Hidden Sword Venerable's voice turned gloomy. "I'm too old. I'm 2,800 years old now. I've been through countless battles in my life. If I still had my Golden Core, I would have been able to survive for another 100 or 200 years. But now, I've already infused all of my cultivation into my natal divine sword. The only reason I'm still alive is because of the medicine I took earlier. But this won't last for too long. 40 years, 30 years, 20 years. I don't know. I have to leave a way out for the Hidden Sword sect. At the same time, I have to settle some grudges." Xing Hui looked at Hidden Sword Venerable. It was the first time he saw a cultivator facing the fate of dying of old age. At that moment, he did not know how to answer. Life and death is a constant. I have lived for so many years, I have seen through it. The Hidden Sword Venerable looked at Qing Su and smiled faintly. "Your sword intent is very pure. If you want to maintain this purity, you need to have a clear mind. As a result, I'm not afraid of you going back on your word. Otherwise, your promise today will become a demon in your future, a shackle that will stop you from attaining great achievement in the way of the sword." To be honest, I'm lucky to have met a cultivator with pure sword intent like you in my limited time left. It'll truly allow me to pass on my way of the sword and the hidden sword sect without worry. Qing Su met the hidden sword venerable's gentle gaze. Even though he knew what the hidden sword venerable was scheming, he did not resent him at all. Instead, he promised seriously, "Don't worry, hidden sword venerable. Unless I die, I'll definitely do everything I can to assist the hidden sword venerable the moment I receive news that you're in trouble. I trust you." Hidden sword venerable nodded solemnly. Most of the time, when one understood the other party's sword will and knew what kind of person they were, one would be able to trust them unconditionally. For a swordsman, it was that simple. Come with me. I hope that the resources I have accumulated will be enough for you to form your golden core. Chapter 487. Under the guidance of Hidden Sword Venerable, Tsing Hui soon arrived at a loft. There was also an array around the loft, but it was mainly used as a warning. As Tsing Hui stepped into the loft, all kinds of rare and precious resources appeared in front of him. Tsing Hui looked at them one by one and was dazzled. Although the value of each of these resources was not too high, there were so many of them that it was shocking. With so many resources, it would be easy to condense 2 or 3 superior-grade golden cores, let alone one. If he was willing to combine all of these resources and sell them together, he would be able to exchange for 4 digits of Dao aura value. This would definitely be the largest amount of wealth he had encountered since he came to this world. There are so many of them, Tsing Hui was deeply surprised. After a few hundred years, you should have some assets. Hidden Sword Venerable said with a smile. Qing Su glanced through the resources one by one. He had no use for some of them, but close to half of them were useful to him. Close to half was enough for him to condense a high-grade golden core. As for the remaining half, it would be easy for him to use them. All he needed to do was make a trip to the Heavenly Desolate region and use the channels of the 6 great merchant associations to change them. With these resources and the 2 divine beast bloodlines in Tsing Hui's body, he had a bold idea in his mind. Burial Sword Peak is barely safe. With the array outside protecting it, not to mention Golden Core Realm cultivators, even powerful figures who have cultivated divine powers will die if they rush in recklessly. You don't have to worry about danger if you cultivate in seclusion here. You can ask me if there is anything you don't understand during this period. Hidden Sword Venerable said. Then I will nag Hidden Sword Venerable, but Tsing Hui thought of the Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce and wanted to tell Hidden Sword Venerable. However, he considered that Hidden Sword Venerable was only strong in appearance. Although he had a powerful sword will that was not inferior to the peak of the Saint Realm, his divine powers and body had not merged with his natal divine sword. Even if he told Hidden Sword Venerable about the Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce, he would not be able to handle it. If he showed up rashly and showed his weakness, it would cause endless trouble. After all, when the Hidden Sword Venerable swept through the Hidden Sword continent, he had offended many experts. It would not be too late to deal with the North Moon Peak and the Aurora Peak after he reached the Golden Core Realm, or after the Hidden Sword Venerable's cultivation and the natal divine sword were completely fused into one. With the sword intent of the Hidden Sword Venerable not long ago, the North Moon Peak and the Aurora Peak would not dare to act rashly. All right, I'll start condensing my golden core and begin forging my natal divine sword. Hidden Sword Venerable nodded. What materials are you lacking? I've collected some, see if they can be of any use to you. Also, I have dozens of high-level sword forging recipes, you can take them for reference. As he spoke, Tsing Hui waved his hand, and dozens of sword forging materials that were at least level 10 appeared in front of him. I really do need a sword forging recipe. Take a look at it yourself. Hidden Sword Venerable laughed and took out a jade talisman. All the sword forging recipes I've collected over the years are here, from level 9 to level 10 to level 15. I've spent a lot of effort on sword forging and am a master of sword forging. Unfortunately, it's better for you to forge your own natal divine sword. It's not suitable for others to forge it. Therefore, when the time comes, you'll have to rely on yourself. Do you have the divine blessing technique? If you don't, You can use an item that carries Tao with 100 Taoist rhymes to point it out. I do. Xing Hui nodded. Is Hidden Sword Venerable a master of sword forging? Back then, due to various reasons, I squandered all of my chaos level on the advancement technique. Now that I think about it, if I could have maxed out my comprehension and sword Dao talent, I would have long comprehended the ultimate sword Dao. I wouldn't have to wait until I'm at the end of my rope. You maxed out the advancement technique? Hidden Sword Venerable nodded. There's no harm in telling you this. I'm currently at the 29th level of Chaos, with the advancement technique taking up the 10th level, the divine protection technique taking up the 5th level, and the personal space, perception, recovery, divine technique, and even luck, resurrection, and transformation technique taking up the 14th level of Chaos. As a result, my 29th level of Chaos doesn't provide any significant boost to my cultivation, and my perception is only at the 4th level. As for the 30th level of Chaos, the consumption of 365 Taoist rhymes per year has already exceeded my limit. Although the Hidden Sword continent produces around 200 Taoist rhymes per year, it's still not enough to support the 30th level of Chaos. Thus, the 29th level is already my limit, and there's no hope for my perception and sword Dao to reach the 10th level. Xing Hui nodded. In fact, this was the downside of not having a master to guide him. Without a proper plan for the chaotic level, the allocation of points would naturally be extremely chaotic. Often, they would choose to upgrade a certain ability whenever they needed it. This was a very common phenomenon among the Sons of Chaos. After all, apart from those who had a powerful backer and background, who could guarantee that they would be able to upgrade their Son of Chaos? Who could guarantee that they wouldn't be affected halfway through their cultivation path? It's best that you arrange your chaotic level properly. If your comprehension and sword principle talent increase, your path to the ultimate sword principle will definitely be smoother. I understand. Xing Hui responded. He was currently at the 47th chaotic level. If he guessed correctly, the chaotic treasure pavilion would definitely transform once he reached the 60th chaotic level. At that time, only the heavens knew how much Taoist rhymes he would consume every day. As a result, he could only increase his chaotic level to the 12th chaotic level. He had to make good use of these 12 chaotic levels. He couldn't squander or waste them at all. At the very least, as he switched to sword principle, one of his comprehension and sword principle talent would have to be upgraded to level 10. Sword Sovereign, I'm a little curious. What will happen if the advancement technique is upgraded to level 10? You can't underestimate any special ability when it reaches the 10th level, and the advancement technique is no exception. Before the 4th level, the advancement technique can only upgrade weapons within the 4th level by 1 level. When it reaches the 5th level, this restriction increases by 1 level. That is to say, at the 5th level, you can upgrade weapons up to the 6th level, and the 6th level advancement technique can upgrade weapons up to the 7th level, and so on. When it reaches the 10th level, not only can it upgrade weapons up to the 11th level, it also has a special effect, which is to disregard the rules and upgrade weapons by 1 level on the basis of the original weapons. Sword Sovereign Hidden Sword smiled at this point. Although the cooldown for the level 10 advancement technique is as long as a year, and any weapon can only be upgraded once, you should be able to imagine how powerful it is. On the basis of the original divine weapons grade, ignoring the rules, raise it by 1 grade. Xing Hui's heart trembled. This special effect was unbelievably powerful. At this moment, Xing Hui finally understood why Sword Sovereign Hidden Sword was able to collect so many cultivation resources. It should be known that if a young master of a first-rate faction wanted to condense a superior golden core, it would take the faction hundreds or even thousands of years to do so. Even though Sword Sovereign Hidden Sword was located in the Hidden Sword continent, and his income was not inferior to any first-rate faction, it did not make sense that Sword Sovereign Hidden Sword was able to condense a few superior golden cores. However, now that Sword Sovereign Hidden Sword was talking about the level 10 advancement technique, Xing Hui could understand why. At the same time, he also understood why the weapons in the hands of the cultivators of the major factions were usually 1 or 2 levels higher than the cultivators themselves. He originally thought that it was because of the destruction of the divine wilderness, but now it seemed that the advancement technique and divine protection technique were the main reasons. Alright, you don't have to think too much about the advancement technique. Other than those families that specialize in forging, who would be willing to spend so much effort on the advancement technique? After all, the advancement technique is a secret technique that was derived from the level 5 chaos realm. If one deliberately cultivated it, they would only be able to achieve this after reaching level 14. Xing Hui nodded. Take a look at these sword forging recipes and choose a sword that you want to forge. If there are any materials that you lack, I can see if I can find a way for you. All right. Xing Hui responded and began to search through the recipes. This is... After a while, Xing Hui's attention was attracted by a level 14 divine weapon. Dragon Abyss Sword? Looking at the Dragon Abyss Sword, he suddenly thought of something. Sword Sovereign? Is this Dragon Abyss Sword the legendary 7-star demon refining sword of the Hidden Sword sect? When the Hidden Sword Venerable heard the Green Ruins mention the Dragon Abyss Sword, he could not help but be slightly taken aback. After a while, he laughed. I've heard of the rumors of the 7-star demon culling sword, but I've stayed in the Hidden Sword sect for over 1,000 years, and yet I've never even seen the shadow of this ancient divine sword. Oh, it's not that I've never seen it before. At the very least, the sword manual in your hands was an accidental discovery, and it's the only thing that has anything to do with the 7-star demon culling sword. However, if the 7-star demon culling sword really is some sort of extraordinary ancient divine sword, then its level wouldn't just be a mere level 14. You have to know that during the divine wilderness era, there were powerful beings at the peak of the saint realm who could create a world with a single thought. Hearing this, Xing Hui nodded slightly. But looking at the recipe of the Dragon Abyss Sword in his hands, he felt that this recipe was not simple. After looking at it for a while, the recipe of the Dragon Abyss Sword mentioned that the core of the sword was an item that contained sword intent. This made him make a decision. When the time comes, I will try to forge the Dragon Abyss Sword. Dragon Abyss Sword? You have to think carefully. It is only a 14th level divine sword. Don't choose it just because it has a similar name to that ancient divine sword. I remember that in the recipe I gave you, there were some 15th level and even 2 16th level divine weapons. Although the quality of the materials required for a 15th level and 16th level divine weapon is extremely high, once it is successfully forged, it will greatly increase your strength. I understand. But I still want to give it a try. I want to see how profound the Dragon Abyss Sword is after it is forged. In any case, a 14th level divine weapon is enough for me. Seeing that Xing Hui had already made up his mind, the Hidden Sword Venerable did not force him. He nodded his head and said, Fine, it's easier to gather the materials required for a 14th level divine weapon. If there's anything else you need, let me know. Xing Hui swept his gaze over the materials that the Hidden Sword Venerable took out. These are already enough. Good. I will be outside the courtyard. If there's anything you need, just call for me. The Hidden Sword Venerable nodded his head to Xing Hui and left the pavilion. Chapter 488. Venerable Hidden Sword. I owe him a favor. If I can't teach the disciple I picked from the Hidden Sword sect to become an almighty, I'm afraid I won't be able to repay this favor. Standing in the attic, Xing Hui looked at the massive amount of resources before him that were worth thousands of Taoist rhymes. He could not help but sigh. If he had to collect them all by himself, how long would it take him to collect so many resources? But now, thanks to Venerable Hidden Sword, he had easily skipped the stage of collecting resources that would take an ordinary person a few hundred years to do. Xing Hui paused for a moment on the resources before he quickly focused his attention on his spiritual world. In his spiritual world, the Golden Crow Divine Soul was affected by the Sword Will and became a little dispirited. As for the Torch Dragon Divine Soul, it was already weakening and going downhill. If he did not find a way to turn the situation around, the Torch Dragon Divine Soul would definitely collapse in no time. I have to make a choice between the Torch Dragon and the Golden Crow. Sword Dao requires purity. I can't forge 2 natal divine weapons. Xing Hui thought of his Dongyang Sword Codex and glanced at the massive amount of resources in the attic that was enough to form 3 or 4 superior-grade golden cores. He immediately came to a decision. With the Golden Crow Divine Soul as the core, he would refine the Golden Crow Divine Soul into a golden core. Furthermore, when the golden core was formed, he would feed the Golden Crow Divine Soul with the Torch Dragon Divine Soul and let the Golden Crow Divine Body devour the Torch Dragon Divine Body. This would allow his golden core to break through and become a golden core sovereign. Golden core sovereign. Xing Hui took a deep breath. If he wanted to become a golden core sovereign, his current spiritual power level was still not high enough. Therefore, he still had to explore the use of the broken sword to its limit. Only in this way could he subdue the broken sword. Only in this way could he use the broken sword as a foundation and use the divine blessing technique to forge a divine sword and refine it into his natal divine sword. Cultivation did not take months. In the blink of an eye, 3 months had passed. In these 3 months, the Hidden Sword sect enjoyed a rare period of peace. Even though the Hidden Sword Venerable did not appear, nor did he pursue the responsibility of the Aurora Peak and the North Moon Peak, the entire Hidden Sword sect still became harmonious after realizing that the Hidden Sword Venerable was not dead yet. Especially the cultivators who had violated the interests of the Hidden Sword sect, they were even more afraid. Some of the people who had committed serious crimes even took advantage of the fact that the Hidden Sword Venerable had not appeared to secretly escape from the Hidden Sword continent. The standard of the cultivators of the Hidden Sword continent was higher than that of the Eastern Wasteland world. In addition, it was not far from the Heaven Wasteland world, and it was much easier for them to escape safely than from the Eastern Wasteland world. It was understandable that these people chose to leave because they were worried about being held accountable. And these people included the Peak Master of the North Moon Peak, Mu Xingyi, Great Elder Bei Shentong, and Sect Master Qi Xian's disciple, North Moon Xian. Without these people, the reputation of the North Moon Peak plummeted and was no longer as glorious as before. On the other hand, the Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce, because Xing Hui had been summoned by the Hidden Sword Venerable and seemed to be highly regarded by the Hidden Sword Venerable, and considering that Xing Hui came from the Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce, the attitude of the people towards the Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce naturally changed greatly. In particular, the decline of the North Moon Peak and the change of ownership of many resource points made the Divine Grace Chamber of Commerce the biggest winner. Except for the fact that they did not have a golden core expert, they had already vaguely recovered to their peak. Xing Hui did not know about this. In these 3 months, he maximized the cooperation between the backtracking technique and the broken sword to temper his mind and sharpen his will, causing the level of his mind to increase explosively. In just 3 months, his mind level had already rushed to an astonishing level of 106. 106. This number was close to the limit of the help that the broken sword could provide him. The effects of the broken sword are getting weaker and weaker. Next, I can only reforge the broken sword and the Azure Lotus Divine Sword. According to the sword formula of the Dragon Abyss Sword, coupled with supreme treasures like the Void Fragmentation Divine Stones and Divine Meteorite Metal, I wonder what kind of divine sword I can forge in the end. Xing Hui muttered to himself. Then, he came to the sword forging room on the Burial Sword Peak and took out the broken sword, Azure Lotus Divine Sword, Void Fragmentation Divine Stones, Divine Meteorite Metal, and a series of ores and spiritual items needed to forge the Dragon Abyss Sword. He threw them all into the furnace in the sword forging room. Next, naturally, he used the Divine Protection technique and waited. The characteristics of the Chaos Divine Palace had been so domineering since ancient times. It could even ignore the rules and ignore the materials used to forcefully raise the level of a divine weapon by 1 level, let alone forge a divine weapon by smelting various materials together. Xing Hui just watched from the side, waiting for the Dragon Abyss Sword to be truly forged. As the divine sword gradually took shape, a faint wave of pressure spread out from the sword, and it became stronger and stronger. However, Xing Hui could sense that this wave of pressure did not come from the Dragon Abyss Sword. It came from the 2 main materials of the Dragon Abyss Sword, the Broken Sword and the Azure Lotus Divine Sword. When the 2 of them merged together, the strength of the sword intent increased tremendously, which was why it could create such a shocking wave of pressure. After 20 hours, the wave of pressure that came from the sword intent level of the Dragon Abyss sword rose to its peak and gradually dissipated. After another hour, the blazing flames in the furnace gradually subsided, and an uncarved divine sword was instantly formed. There was no earth-shattering momentum, nor was there any sword whistling in all directions. Looking at the Dragon Abyss sword that had returned to its calm state and did not emit any waves of pressure, Xinghui almost thought that there was a problem with the divine protection technique. After pondering for a moment, Xinghui did not hold the sword. Instead, he released his sword intent and blasted it into the Dragon Abyss sword. Almost at the instant when his sword intent clashed with the sword intent of the Dragon Abyss sword, a vast, majestic, blazing, and violent sword intent had already ruthlessly followed the trajectory of his sword intent and blasted into his spiritual world. Furthermore, it continued to crush his spiritual world. This sword intent. Feeling the wave of pressure from the sword intent, Xinghui revealed a faint smile on his face. With the help of this sword intent suppression, it shouldn't be a problem for my spiritual level to rise to level 110. He originally had the idea of using the divine protection technique to merge the Azure Lotus divine sword and the broken sword into one to create an even stronger spiritual impact and use this energy to continue refining his spiritual power. When he turned the two of them into materials for the Dragon Abyss sword, Xinghui originally thought that the effect would be weakened, but he did not expect. Not only did it not weaken, but the pressure from the merging of the two sword intents was even stronger than he had imagined. If I can withstand the impact of this sword intent and completely refine this sword intent, I'll be able to borrow the power of this sword intent to subdue the power of the Golden Crow and Torch Dragon divine bodies that have been merged into the Dragon Abyss sword. By then, the Dragon Abyss sword that has merged with the power of the three would definitely become even stronger. As he thought, Xinghui held the Dragon Abyss sword and carefully sensed the characteristics of this level 14 divine weapon. The sword intent was one of the characteristics. The second characteristic, sturdy. After smelting the divine meteorite metal, the Dragon Abyss sword could be said to be extremely sturdy. The third characteristic came from the void fragmentation divine stone. Crushing characteristic. As Xinghui held the divine sword, a powerful sword intent came crashing down. While it was resisting the Dragon Abyss sword, he raised the sword and slashed it forward. Instantly, layers of ripples spread out from the tip of the sword. It was as though the space was being sliced open by the sword. Under this crushing characteristic, all defensive treasures and divine abilities will be severely restrained. In this way, the power of the Tao of offense that has already reached the extreme will reach a whole new level. As Xinghui held the Dragon Abyss sword, he was extremely satisfied with this sword. It's a divine sword? At this moment, Sword Honorable Hidden Sword walked in after hearing the commotion outside the pavilion. That's right. Sword Honorable Hidden Sword looked at the Dragon Abyss sword in Xinghui's hand. His eyes lit up when he felt the terrifying sword intent of this divine sword. Great sword! If you can completely subdue the sword intent in this sword, it will be much easier for you to fuse your cultivation into the sword. Moreover, once the fusion is successful, the power of this life-bound sword of yours will become even more terrifying, to the extent that it will be able to resist divine abilities. Withstand divine abilities? Even though Qing Su had come into contact with divine ability realm experts more than once, he had never actually seen them use their abilities, so he had no idea about the true power of abilities. Now that he heard the Hidden Sword Venerables say that he could actually fend off the abilities of powerful beings if he forged the Dragon Abyss sword into a life-bound sword and fused it together, he immediately asked, just how powerful are the abilities of abilities? Divine abilities are ever-changing and not limited to just one type. Therefore, if you want to ask me how powerful a divine ability is, I can only say that it depends on the person's understanding and application of the divine ability. However, no matter how weak a divine ability is, if used properly, it will have an incredible destructive effect. It is not something that cultivators below the divine ability realm can withstand. This is a terrifying technique that will dominate the world. Xing Hui nodded after hearing Sword Honorable Hidden Sword's words. As for how powerful a divine ability was, he would have to wait until his cultivation base was high enough to test it out. After being stimulated by your sword essence, I have a feeling that my divine ability, body, and soul will be completely merged with the hidden sword within a year. When that time comes, I will be able to unsheath the divine sword in my hand. Sword Honorable Hidden Sword said with a hint of eagerness, I really hope that day will come soon. A year very soon. Sword Honorable Hidden Sword nodded heavily. Then, Sword Honorable Hidden Sword explained to Xing Hui what he needed to pay attention to in order to form the golden core. Then he left the pavilion. Seeing Sword Honorable Hidden Sword leave, Xing Hui frowned slightly. He had a feeling that someone was chasing after Sword Honorable Hidden Sword. He had no choice but to quickly find a way to obtain more power. In order to obtain this power, he even gave up his lifespan of 100 or 200 years and chose to take the risk to cultivate the divine sword. Furthermore, Sword Honorable Hidden Sword Honorable Elder made him the supreme elder of the Hidden Sword sect to protect the Hidden Sword sect. He even wanted him to choose a disciple from the Hidden Sword sect to cultivate. It felt as if he was making arrangements for his death. Time waits for no one. After a moment of silence, Xing Hui did not say anything else. Sword Honorable Hidden Sword, who had already broken through to the lawful embodiment of heaven and earth, had no choice but to take the risk. That kind of enemy was not someone he could easily provoke. What he needed to do now was to complete the tempering of his mind as soon as possible and refine the Long Yuan sword into his natal spiritual sword. Secondly, he needed to condense the golden elixir. Once he refined the Long Yuan sword into his natal spiritual sword, he would melt the golden elixir into it. As for the rest, even if he wanted to help, there was nothing he could do. Qing Su has finally completed the transformation of his cultivation system. I wonder what level he'll reach when he emerges from seclusion with his Qing Su Golden Core? Will there be a wave of rewards to cheer for Xing Hui? You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.